everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Crossover anime joining the chat group with infinite amplification. Chapter 181 to 200, Chapter 181, The Temporal Extraction and the Shattered Skepticism of the AST, the Sect of the God of Creation. Origami Tabichi muttered, her voice laced with deep confusion. The Sect of the God of Creation spans across infinite cosmic nodes and myriad realities. We all unconditionally revere the supreme, omnipotent God of creation. Takumi explained smoothly, initializing his deceptive script with absolute composure. The mirror of the past, the Sect of the God of Creation. Myriad realities. A supreme divinity. Origami Tabichi stood utterly frozen, staring at Takumi, as if her visual sensors were auditing a complete lunatic. Had this towering entity claimed to be the first male spirit in global history, her cognitive firewalls would have accorded the statement a baseline tier of validity. But a literal god? It scaled to nothing more than a preposterous, unrefined farce. However, the strategic movement Takumi authorized next instantaneously locked down her absolute attention. Takumi casually snapped his fingers. The void directly before his coordinates violently rippled like a localized disturbance across a tranquil pool of water, seamlessly transmuting the space into a massive, shimmering mirror of pure celestial light. Deep within the luminous surface of the mirror, infinite rows of environmental data and historical memory logs began to rapidly rewind at a hypersonic index. In the subsequent second, the gathered cohort caught sight of a burning residential structure, its foundations completely consumed beneath a raging, sky-blotting sea of crimson fire. Trapped right dead center within the inferno were two distinct silhouettes, a deeply devoted husband and wife completely engulfed by the destructive elemental payload. Standing directly before their collapsing forms was a fragile, silver-haired little girl. This is... Origami Tabichi's pale blue eyes violently expanded to their absolute physical limits. An involuntary, high-decibel shriek tore straight through her vocal matrix. During her early cycles, the young Origami Tabichi had preserved an exceptionally beautiful, standard childhood, scaling smoothly through her development under the deep, unyielding love of her parents. However, the exact milestone she checked at 11 years of age, her family line was permanently sundered during a catastrophic assault executed by a mysterious spirit arriving from the future timeline. From that catastrophic microsecond forward, her soul code had permanently integrated an absolute, unyielding hatred toward all spirits. Hourglass not done, the defiance of cosmic law, the historical visualization frozen completely at the terminal millisecond precisely before the fatal strike could erase her parents from the server. Then, navigating beneath the completely stunned, paralyzed gazes of the entire multiversal vanguard, the targeted man and woman inside the temporal archive were gently enveloped by an invisible, logic-defying cosmic authority, forcefully dragging their physical matrices straight out of the virtual past into the absolute reality of the present space-time coordinate. Is death, through what manner of mechanical law is a transaction of this density possible? Satoru Gojo, could it genuinely constitute? Accelerator, hey, turn the simulation variables off for a second. Is this absolute reality, or am I running a corrupted script? Boa Hancock, to forcefully manipulate the foundational threads of time to this preposterous degree. The sovereign's authority completely eclipses all imagination. Kurumi Tokisaki felt her cognitive centers short-circuit from pure, unadulterated mental exhaustion. Exactly what kind of reality-shattering script was unrolling before her sensors? She flatly failed to compute the underlying mechanics. Could these mysterious entities refrain from acting like absolute riddle-makers for a single phase? Lacking concrete data blocks tracking Takumi's true power tier, her processors completely lacked the capacity to simulate what he was actively executing, or rather, her mind formulated the terrifying hypothesis, but her logical firewalls fiercely refused to accord it baseline validity. Within a literal fraction of a heartbeat, the planetary atmosphere violently convulsed. Pitch-black thunderclouds instantly blanketed the metropolitan skyline, continuous rows of apocalyptic lightning violently detonating across the coordinates as the starry firmament itself began to dangerously sway. Infinite streaks of world-purifying tribulation thunder aggressively condensed within the void, carrying a devastating, apocalyptic weight engineered explicitly to execute absolute divine punishment upon any transdimensional asset attempting to violate cosmic laws. The absolute weight of the environmental pressure ruthlessly clamped down on every square inch of the street. The vanguard cohort simultaneously held their breath, their biological frames shivering as their internal security systems flagged an extreme, unmapped hazard tier. Reversing the space-time continuum to forcefully resurrect long-deleted life forms represented an absolute, direct violation of the universe's primary source code. Yet, despite the terrifying celestial fury agitating the sky, the group companions harbored zero personal panic. Pinned alongside an elite multiverse-class titan whose raw parameters outscaled the absolute limits of human imagination, their calculators computed that the Overlord would effortlessly neutralize the cosmic backlash, shielding their vessels while forcefully finalizing the resurrection protocol. The dissolution of Wrath. In the subsequent microsecond, a completely preposterous masterclass in absolute authority unfolded. Takumi merely raised his silver-haired head a fraction of an inch, casting a brief, entirely indifferent glance straight toward the raging firmament. That solitary look seamlessly, ruthlessly pierced through the multidimensional fabric of the cosmos, violently sundering the energetic anchors structuring the storm. The catastrophic, world-purifying tribulation thunder that had threatened to flatten the sector instantaneously dissolved into absolute nothingness, completely wiped from the active grid within a single chronological tick. The trembling stars stilled, and the planetary sky restored its baseline calm. The entire assembly stood completely, hopelessly deadlocked, their logical mainframes insisting that they were navigating a surreal optical illusion. Directly before their visual receptors, Origami Tabichi's biological parents had been flawlessly extracted from the historical time-space stream, successfully transitioning from abstract memory data into authentic, breathing bodies of warm flesh and blood. A perfect, causality-defying resurrection. A literal, perfect resurrection. Kurumi Tokusaki's heterochromic irises expanded to their absolute limits, her gaze burning with an explosive cocktail of fanatical intensity and absolute psychological shock. Her internal spirit violently churned, a wild ocean of emotion threatening to short-circuit her gears. The silver-haired men had just flawlessly restored 2 human life cycles straight from the temporal grave, completely free of any structural deficits. The output was absolute perfection. If her terminal could successfully petition this supreme entity to authorize a parallel deployment vector, wouldn't it be mathematically elementary for his authority to flawlessly resurrect the long line of monsterized, civilian girls whom her own hands had been programmatically compelled to slaughter across historical timelines? The agonizing memory log detailing her childhood companion, Sawa Yamauchi, violently flooded her processing cores, causing her emotional firewalls to completely melt down. Simultaneously, Origami Tabichi's internal stability modules sustained a total, catastrophic collapse. She stared blankly at the deeply bewildered, perfectly restored parents standing before her coordinates. Her vocal arrays completely failed to produce a single byte of text. Her physical vessel merely lunged forward, violently locking her mother and father within a frantic, weeping embrace. Takumi's methodology operated with a beautifully clinical, direct, and brutal efficiency. He commanded absolute zero necessity to deploy complex verbal manipulation to sway her loyalty. A solitary, undeniable manifestation of reality-warping divine power was more than dense enough to completely override Origami's psychological parameters. The strategic preservation, my office is deeply amused by your localized family reunion loop, but the current space-time environment flatly declines to present an optimal window for extensive dialogue. With a smooth, casual wave of his long black sleeve, Takumi executed a high-tier sleeve dimension subroutine. Origami Tabichi's parents were instantaneously scaled down through localized spatial compression, seamlessly translocated into the absolute safety of the divine kingdom. Through what mechanical treachery have your arrays vanished, my parents? Beholding the sudden deletion of her mother and father from the landing grid, Origami panicked violently. She lunged forward, desperately grabbing Takumi's armored cuff, as her eyes scanned the empty street. As my vocal arrays explicitly stated, the current environment presents a severe hazard profile targeting their unenhanced structures. Takumi responded calmly, pointing a long finger straight toward the firmament. High above their heads, the forced structural macrofusion of the 2 parallel Earths was relentlessly advancing. If their vanguard failed to permanently freeze the gravitational vectors, both planetary servers would inevitably sustain an absolute, irreversible deletion loop. Origami Tabichi's vocal arrays went completely dark. Her analytical modules verified that the space-time layout was indeed completely hostile to civilian lifelines, yet the sheer velocity of the miracles was entirely too massive for her emotional caps to comfortably process. Does your terminal accord a baseline tier of validity to my prior declarations now? Takumi questioned flatly. Confronted by an empirical manifestation of this preposterous density, through what logical programming could Origami Tabichi dare to assert that a true God failed to rule reality? Though the paradigm completely sundered every scientific law hard-coded into her AST training, the empirical data resting in her ledger was absolute and unyielding. Satoru Gojo and the remaining group companions watched the silver-haired girl whose psychological parameters had been completely, masterfully dismantled and rebuilt by Takumi's actions, their expressions turning exceptionally weird. The boss could have easily deployed a basic kinetic payload to knock the screeching nuisance unconscious within a millisecond, yet his station went out of its way to perfectly rewrite the space-time continuum to resurrect her dead parents. Could our supreme leader secretly harbor a localized romantic interest targeting this white-haired maiden? Naturally, they merely allowed the dangerous deduction to loop inside their private mental firewalls, completely lacking the suicidal audacity to ever voice the script face-to-face. The blind spot of the nightmare, the sect of the god of creation unyieldingly adheres to the supreme mandates authorized by the sovereign, permanently dedicated to maintaining the absolute structural integrity and peace across the myriad heavens and infinite realities. Our planetary scanners successfully isolated the critical space-time catastrophe agitating your server. Takumi continued his grand narrative, his voice carrying a deeply moving, noble resonance. While an event of this scale tracks as an insignificant, low-tier glitch across our filters, it represents an absolute existential horror for unenhanced mortal assets. The exact microsecond the planetary grids collide, infinite lifelines will be permanently deleted from the database. Ergo, our vanguard has cleared the gateway strictly to shepherd your world line past this disaster. The noble exposition was articulated with such flawless, beautifully moving precision that he almost managed to convince his own internal processors. Origami Tabichi sank into a deep, hyper-reflective trance. Critically analyzing the variables, an entity commanding the absolute authority to effortlessly reverse death, could have liquidated their entire AST division with a solitary wisp of his presence. He clearly harbored zero malicious underlying directives targeting their populace. Deep waves of sudden remorse agitate her system. She had historically classified these magnificent multiversal saviors as primitive local spirits, even authorizing weapons-grade artillery strikes against their columns. I genuinely hold your processors. A massive, logic-defying blind spot suddenly flagged within her cognitive database. Something is mechanically corrupted across this layout. That maiden standing directly adjacent to your coordinates, her signature explicitly maps within our highest threat registry as a cataclysmic spirit. Codenamed Nightmare. Origami Tabichi's cognitive centers suddenly snapped back to alertness. She aggressively pointed a trembling finger straight toward Kurumi Tokasaki's coordinates. Previously, because her emotional firewalls had been completely shattered by the absolute zero readouts on the sensor, her logic had flatly ignored the physical presence of the spirit of time. Pondering the parameters now, even assuming her sensor returned an anomalous zero value, that visual template indisputably indexed as nightmare. Your data logs are running a severe correlation error, Miss Origami. Her identity completely fails to index as the rogue spirit your systems track. Takumi unrolled a smooth, beautifully clinical cover script, his face remaining an absolute mask of tranquility. Her true name tracks across our registry as Sawa Yamauchi. Her external visual template merely happens to preserve a high-density structural similarity alongside your local spirit. After all, across the boundless configurations of the myriad heavens and infinite realities, localized dimensional doppelgangers are a standard statistical constant. Isn't that right, Sawa Yamauchi? As the final syllable cleared his lips, Takumi pivoted his ice-blue irises, casting a deeply meaningful, hyper-deliberate look straight toward Kurumi Tokasaki. Kurumi Tokasaki. At this historic milestone, pinned beneath the concentrated, hyper-focus gaze of the entire multiversal vanguard cohort, the spirit of time felt her internal systems completely burn out from pure, unadulterated mental exhaustion. Chapter 182, Chapter 182, The Deceptive Shroud and the Gender-Bent Transmigrator 1469 words. Your real designation tracks as Sawa Yamauchi. Origami Tabichi questioned, her pale blue irises narrowing as she deep-scanned Kurumi Tokisaki with intense suspicion. Kurumi Tokisaki was left completely speechless. I'm Sawa Yamauchi. Since when did my baseline code map to the identity of Sawa Yamauchi? Yet, running a quick internal diagnostic loop, she instantly realized that this random designation was far from a careless software error. Takumi was explicitly, deliberately transmitting a hidden subtext straight to her processors. If she desperately craved the absolute, flawless resurrection of the real Sawa Yamauchi down the timeline, her terminal had to unconditionally play along with his script. Compelled by this sudden realization, Kurumi had zero choice but to smoothly patch the communication line. Kurumi Tokisaki. My database completely fails to recognize whatever unrefined child you are speaking of. My registered name is Sawa Yamauchi. Hearing her seamless alignment with the lie, the facial muscles of the surrounding Vanguard members twitched subtly. They couldn't restrain a collective, silent roll of their eyes toward their newcomer Takumi. Poor Origami Tabichi had been so thoroughly hoodwinked that her logical faculties were completely crippled. It appeared their new multiversal group companion was far from a standard saint, casually, effortlessly manipulating an innocent, beautiful frontline maiden without breaking a sweat. Is that absolute reality? Origami's rigid posture visibly faltered, her deep-seated conviction sustaining another structural fracture. No matter how meticulously her visual sensors scanned the target, the physical matrix before her perfectly cloned the exact framework of Kurumi Tokisaki. Yet, it remained an undeniable, empirical constant that her high-tech diagnostic device isolated absolute zero spirit energy fluctuations from the girl's coordinates. On top of that, a literal multiversal vanguard node had actively unrolled an institutional endorsement to verify her identity. Had her own processing units genuinely committed a massive tracking error? So does your terminal care to formally integrate into my sect of the god of creation? Takumi smoothly extended a magnificent tactical olive branch. Origami Tabichi was an elite combat asset after all. Her psychological systems rapidly cleared the residual shock to restore baseline functionality. Dropping gracefully onto one knee directly before Takumi's towering frame, she vocalized with absolute, trembling earnestness, "My life code is entirely willing to submit to the faith. I humbly implore your presence to grant my vessel the sovereign right to join your sacred sect." The multiversal commentary deep within the active parameters of the multiversal chat channel, the group members auditing the live combat broadcast completely burst into a state of high-volume hilarity. Umaradoma, wahaha. My internal systems are experiencing a total ventilation failure from laughing so hard. The newcomer is delightfully, magnificently wicked. Poor Kurumi is being driven completely up the wall. Tony Stark, is it just my visor running a distorted script, or does this transactional layout perfectly mirror the exact architectural mechanics of a high-tier multiversal pyramid scheme? Saitenshi, to effortlessly coordinate the total conversion of a devout elite believer within such a compressed chronological window, our newest group companion truly commands a terrifying persuasion matrix. Nagato Uzumaki, if your systems analyze the environmental variables strictly from her localized perspective, any logical asset would unconditionally surrender their theological faith. An entity possessing the raw authority to flawlessly reverse a permanent deletion loop with a casual wave of his hand would easily drive infinite mortal populations into a state of absolute, fanatical frenzy. From this historic space-time intersection forward, you are officially a consecrated follower of our faith. However, the current atmospheric variables are highly volatile. Once our vanguard successfully stabilizes this parallel server and purges the localized catastrophe, my office shall return to initialize your translocation protocol, Takumi articulated smoothly, extending a hand to gently lift Origami Tabichi from the asphalt. For the present phase, return to your primary AST unit so your squad mates refrain from running panic subroutines. Understood, Origami articulated with a firm nod, her processors beautifully decoding his underlying subtext. Does my account command the administrative authorization to recruit my fellow squadmates into the divine faith as well? Naturally. That is fully permitted across our operational guidelines, Takumi responded with a composed nod. After authorizing Origami Tabichi to peacefully clear the sector and rejoin the AST Vanguard, Takumi systematically calibrated their trajectory, leading the elite cohort straight toward the precise geographic coordinate his scanning arrays had isolated. Excuse me, but through what specific programmatic manipulation did her spirit energy scanner fail to register a single wisp of my active wavelengths? Kurumi Tokisaki questioned curiously as they paced down the quiet concrete streets. Could the hardware simply be corrupted? The instrument functions flawlessly, the underlying mechanics are far less complex than your mainframes suggest. Takumi unrolled a relaxed chuckle. My authority simply deployed a localized conceptual shroud to cleanly mask the spirit energy bleeding from your biological vessel. A trivial, low-tier calculation. Kurumi Tokisaki froze mid-stride for a microsecond before shaking her head helplessly. Since this multiversal powerhouse had explicitly verified the data field, it had to be an absolute constant even if the sheer scale of it completely shattered her understanding of reality. She desperately craved to extract more data blocks regarding the real Sawa Yamauchi, but recognizing that the active tactical environment wasn't optimal, she forcefully clamped down on her internal anxiety. The doorway of the parallel host following a brief window of pedestrian transit, the cohort smoothly arrived before the gates of the Itsuka residence. Ding dong. Takumi casually pressed the doorbell. Who is it? A short chronological window later, a soft vocal alert cleared from behind the infrastructure before the front door swung open to reveal a young maiden. Her long, dark blue hair cascaded beautifully past her slender, delicate shoulders, and her uneven bangs draped softly across her forehead, partially veiling her deeply dark irises. On the left side of her bangs, a distinct lock of hair was securely gathered by a cute hairband loop, complete with a charming accessory at the tip, adding a highly defined aura of pure cuteness to her baseline features. In unvarnished reality, her visual template perfectly matched Shido Itsuka's cross-dressed appearance from the canonical database. The solitary divergence was that within this specific parallel world line, Shirori Itsuka existed strictly as a biological female. Shido Itsuka has been completely, flawlessly gender-bent on this server, Takumi calculated silently as his eyes scanned her form. Your profile registers as a transmigrator, correct? My office requires a high-volume data exchange. May our Vanguard step inside your living sector to hold a dialogue? Takumi asked, cutting straight to the point. Through what equation did your sensors harvest that intelligence? Shirori Itsuka's features violently warped with absolute shock upon having her core status instantly exposed. After her expressions cycled through deep panic, she fully opened the doorway. Please step inside. Shirori Itsuka politely invited the cohort into the living pavilion, quickly brewing fresh tea to serve the unexpected guests. As the Vanguard elements settled into the room, they briefly exchanged highly amused looks. Although their systems isolated the massive spatial variance of Shido transforming into a biological girl, it fell entirely outside their primary mission objectives, so their vocal arrays remained quiet. Only Kurumi Tokisaki, who completely lacked access to the original meta-knowledge of the timeline, looked thoroughly bewildered. Why on earth were these terrifying interdimensional powerhouses displaying such immense tactical curiosity toward an unenhanced civilian girl? Excuse me, but through what parameters did your scanners decode my underlying identity? After distributing the teacups, Shirori Itsuka sat down, her voice laced with intense confusion and raw anxiety. A native asset native to this world line would flatly never exhibit an energetic spike of your magnitude. Your baseline processing strength scales to an exceptional tier capable of effortlessly crushing an active spirit with a solitary hand. Excluding the clear probability that your profile indexes as a transmigrator, my mainframes return zero alternative hypotheses, Takumi broken down clinically. Kurumi Tokisaki. Hearing his breakdown, the spirit of time felt her cognitive firewalls completely melt down. A transmigrator. An asset capable of ruthlessly crushing a high-threat spirit with a bare palm. Kurumi pivoted her gaze between Shirori Itsuka and Takumi, her entire face a perfect map of profound, unmitigated confusion. Know exactly what manner of cosmic farce is executing here. Through what logic has every single entity I encounter today scaled infinitely stronger than a literal spirit? Auditing the countenances of the remaining Vanguard members, Kurumi isolated absolute zero surprise tracing their features. Beholding this reality, she plummeted into a state of total, hopeless disorientation. Exactly who am I? Where do my coordinates currently rest? What specific directive is my vessel supposed to execute? What preposterous language are these entities speaking? Am I genuinely the solitary unit on this entire planet who completely fails to comprehend a single wisp of data? Chapter 183, Chapter 183, The Defective Cheat and the Multi. 1615 words. This profound sense of isolation was remarkably uncomfortable for Kurumi Tokisaki. However, she possessed more than enough self-awareness to refrain from speaking rashly. Instead, she silently focused her cognitive processing on gathering as many contextual clues as possible from the dialogue blocks flashing between the group. So that is the underlying reality. Shiori Itsuka let out a deep, heavy sigh, her eyes downcast. To be completely honest with you all, if my terminal had been granted a choice, I would have gladly declined to inherit this power. Is that hesitation tied directly to your core system? Satoru Gojo questioned curiously, leaning forward. Shiori Itsuka shifted her gaze toward Satoru Gojo and offered a slow, dejected nod. Precisely. In my previous life cycle, I existed strictly as an unenhanced, shut-in otaku girl. My life code was abruptly terminated by a speeding truck while trying to rescue a stray pedestrian. The exact moment my consciousness rematted, I discovered my soul had been transmigrated into the body of a newborn baby. At the very initialization of this run, I held absolute zero visibility tracking the reality that this server mapped to the date a live universe line. My mainframes failed to comfortably decode the environment until the day I finally met Kodori. Shiori Itsuka unrolled her backstory with absolute earnestness. Takumi effortlessly leveraging his divine authority to seamlessly deep-scan her psychological matrix without encountering a single firewall instantly verified that her verbal logs reflected pure, unvarnished truth. Trope analysis of the Vanguard, throwing one's life force into a speeding truck to secure a civilian's safety, only to initialize a total reincarnation loop. What a wonderfully classic, textbook routine, Satoru Gojo chuckled, adjusting his blindfold. This uncle registers an immense volume of identical plot lines across countless light novels back on my own server. Accelerator clicked his tongue, a smirk dancing across his features. Who would have forecasted that a trash script of that classification actually commanded an empirical baseline in reality? Although the introductory narrative tracks as a highly cliché sequence, her choice explicitly confirms a core variable. Her soul code maintained a remarkably noble framework during her past life cycle. Boa Hancock commented elegantly, her majestic gaze softening a fraction as she evaluated the girl. Moving past the reincarnation phase, that was the precise milestone your network isolated the presence of a system, correct? Death demanded, her icy eyes narrowing as she analyzed the tactical details. Yes, Shiori Itsuka verified, her expression darkening. The exact space-time node I interacted with Kodori, a mechanical notification abruptly detonated inside my neural pathways, instructing my terminal to initialize the software. It designated itself as the God-level family system. The primary directives governing the cheat are simple: establish a family matrix, aggressively cultivate its individual members, and your own baseline parameters will automatically secure a massive rank up. However, evaluating our active ledger up to this present milestone, my family matrix hosts a solitary member, Kodori. The true mandate of the sect. Shiori Itsuka closed her eyes, taking a prolonged, highly controlled breath to calm her vital metrics before fixing her gaze onto Takumi's towering avatar. My office has frankly disclosed its entire database. Yet my own processors are running infinite rows of unmapped queries. Exactly what parameters define your own identity, sir? Commanding clear visibility tracking the canonical profile of Shido Itsuka. Could it be that your station similarly tracks as a transmigrator? Mutual intelligence exchange was an absolute requirement across her strategic models. Even assuming the outcome was harmless, if her own terminal unrolled absolute transparency while the opposing faction maintained an ambiguous, heavily veiled posture, her filters would be programmatically compelled to classify Takumi as a potential threat vector rather than an ally. Negative. Our case tracks as the exact polar opposite. Young maiden, Takumi vocalized smoothly via Sephiroth, a calm, entirely tranquil smile populating his features as he unrolled the institutional script. Our cohort operates strictly as the elite vanguard representing the sect of the God of Creation. Our primary directive on this server is to systematically reclaim the high-threat systems possessed by transmigrators. Not every single transmigrator node navigating the multiverse behaves as a malicious entity. However, these external systems house an exceptionally volatile, reality-breaking hazard tier completely beyond the capacity of an unrefined mortal to safely operate. To safeguard the absolute peace and structural balance of the myriad heavens and infinite realities, our mandate is absolute. You have cleared the gateway to forcefully recycle this garbage system. Seriously. That is absolutely magnificent. Before Takumi could even finalize the administrative phrasing of his holy speech, Shirori Itsuka aggressively cut through the feed, her vocal arrays exploding with pure, unmitigated excitement. Beholding her explosive euphoria, the entire multiversal vanguard including Takumi himself sustained a minor processing freeze, their countenances registering an immense tear of pure surprise. The defective system Takumi stared at Shirori Itsuka, with a highly defined wisp of awkwardness tracking through his systems. Hold your processors. My vanguard hasn't even unrolled the standard threatening terms detailing the extraction process. Through what programming did your terminal authorize absolute compliance this early in the script? Your software lacks basic data blocks tracking our true alignment, yet you are practically begging my office to strip away your ultimate cheat payload. Through what vocabulary am I even supposed to format this breakdown, Mr. Messenger? Shirori Itsuka completely unsealed her chatterbox loops, frantically unleashing a massive wave of complaints directly onto Takumi and the cohort. Your mainframes flatly fail to compute just how thoroughly, systematically diseased this broken system truly operates. My internal gears were initially quite ecstatic when the software granted my vessel the spatial authority to transmigrate into the Date A live world server. However, the absolute main quest it forcefully pushed onto my log commanded my terminal to systematically destroy this entire planet, and violently devour the world's origin source code. Can your calculators even process a madness of that density? It is thoroughly, mentally sick. Furthermore, let my vocal arrays disclose an additional data point, Mr. Messenger. This absolute piece of trash system provides near zero practical utility across my daily schedules, yet it continuously demands that my vessel engage in life or death, cross-dimensional family deathmatches. Setting aside the high probability that my own life cycle will be permanently deleted, if Coteries Lifeline ever sustains a terminal extraction loop because of this cheat, my system flatly refuses to continue running. I don't want to live. This utter garbage software, if my processors preserved the necessary code to manually unbind its matrix from my soul, I would have permanently thrown it into the trash centuries ago. Listening to her frantic, highly emotional rant, Takumi suddenly developed an immense wave of profound empathy for Shirori Itsuka's structural plight. Surviving alongside a broken system of that classification was undeniably an exceptionally brutal experience. Regardless of the peripheral variables, Mr. Messenger, my station implores your presence to aggressively, flawlessly recycle my system this exact microsecond. The remorse of the transmigrator auditing Shirori Itsuka's tearfully hopeful countenance, Takumi maintained an absolute mask of serene tranquility on the exterior yet deep within his primary deity mainframe, his impression parameters shifted beautifully. To state an unvarnished constant, this represented the absolute first milestone where Takumi had encountered a transmigrator node displaying a psychological configuration of this noble caliber. Confronted by a development of this nature, even his supreme consciousness couldn't restrain a wisp of genuine, internal admiration targeting her character. You must rigorously understand, choosing to actively fight against the mandates authorized by a cheat system was conceptually identical to forcefully rejecting every single reality warping convenience, absolute power jump, and material luxury hard-coded into the plugin. Pinned against an evolutionary jackpot of that preposterous scale, preserving the moral fortitude to say no was an exceptionally remarkable, deeply heroic feat for an unrefined mortal soul. However, while the human container tracked as an exceptionally good asset, the system anchoring her matrix was indisputably a highly corrupt, predatory software loop. Destroying the planet to systematically devour the world's origin source code. Miss Itsuka, does your data indicate that the apocalyptic anomalies manifesting across the external atmosphere flow from your system's active subroutines? Satoru Gojo questioned, his tone shifting to a highly focused register. Are you referencing the absolute spatial macrofusion fracturing the sky? My mainframes completely lack data tracking the causal root driving that cataclysm, Shiori Itsuka explained smoothly, her brows knitting together. Coterie was actually compelled to translocate straight back to the Ratatosker command bridge moments ago to deep-scan the phenomenon. Originally, my backup plan was to forcefully exhaust my system's emergency reserves to translocate Coterie entirely out of this world line if the planetary collision hit a terminal threshold. But since your magnificent vanguard has cleared the gateway, Mr. Messenger, my anxiety firewalls should comfortably close, correct? If your coordinates fail to track as the primary source node driving the mutation. Boa Hancock murmured, her slitted gaze sharpening. Then the structural calculations return a solitary, absolute constant. Accelerator's voice dropped into a freezing, hyperlethal register, his crimson irises gleaming with pure tactical malice. The transmigrator entities crawling through the vectors of this world server are flatly far from limited to your solitary unit. Right dead center at that hypercritical space-time intersection, a catastrophic, earth-shattering explosion violently detonated straight from the exterior perimeter. The front security gates protecting the Itsuka infrastructure were instantaneously, ruthlessly blown into microscopic shards. The unvarnished, hyper-aggressive shockwave rippled directly through the living pavilion, the thunderous acoustic roar dense enough to violently agitate the sensory systems of the entire cohort. Every single vanguard element automatically raised their defensive firewalls, their combat parameters violently snapping to absolute maximum alert. The secondary variable had officially cleared the gate. Chapter 184, Chapter 184, the planetary 1643 words you absolute vermin are genuinely gathered here. Accompanied by a thunderous, metal-rending blast, the main security gates of the Itsuka residence were violently blown to pieces. The entire exterior courtyard was instantaneously exposed to the room, unrolling a clear view of the destructive shockwave outside. Striding through the smoking ruins of the threshold was a massive, hulking behemoth of a man standing well over 2 meters in height. Dense, hyperinflated muscle groups bulged aggressively across his entire frame, and a wild, animalistic sneer warped his features, presenting an exceptionally terrifying physical presence. The moment his biological metrics cleared the doorway, his predatory gaze locked dead center onto Takumi and the cohort. So your terminal tracks as the garbage congregation of the sect of the god of creation that Mio disclosed. Humph, nothing more than a pathetic collection of weak little chickens. Watch my fists systematically vaporize your entire column with a solitary strike. Comet the arrogance of the planetary tier. A massive, suffocating wave of raw kinetic energy violently erupted out from the brute's physical vessel. Igniting a wild, bloodthirsty grin, the transmigrator lunged forward, his colossal frame accelerating at a hypersonic velocity that completely defied his massive physical weight. Granted, his database had previously processed the existence of the creation sect via data packets provided by Mio Takamiya, who had similarly transmigrated into this world server. However, his internal calculators had flatly refused to archive the intelligence as a high-tier threat factor. According to Mio's scanning files, the absolute strongest local entity native to that adjacent world line, Isaac Westcott, merely commanded a baseline attribute density indexing at the continental tier. In stark contrast, his own personal parameters proudly checked in at the absolute planetary tier. His raw power output completely, infinitely outscaled the absolute peak performance metrics registered by Westcott. Pinned against a primitive numerical superiority of that definition, his strategic modules naturally maintained an absolute, unshakable confidence. Faced with absolute strength, he commanded absolute certainty. Everyone, raise your defensive firewalls and be careful. Shiori Itsuka vocalized frantically, her expressions violently warping as she attempted to project a timely warning to cover the cohort. The giant intruder's sneer widened into a grim, sadistic mask. The ultimate pleasure his programming craved was to intimately monitor the pathetic, desperate struggles of fragile wretches who could flatly do nothing to alter their permanent deletion codes. It's useless. Your resistance is mathematically zero. Noisy parasite. The zero friction catch. Takumi declined to waste a single byte of processing power on useless dialogue. Moving with absolute, logic-defying tranquility, he calmly extended his bare right hand. He intercepted the planet-crushing fist dead center with his open palm. An apocalyptic kinetic impact violently detonated across the room. The residual shockwave instantaneously flipped the heavy interior furniture upside down, unleashing a screaming atmospheric hurricane that ruthlessly tore through the pavilion, while the concrete flooring beneath their boots shattered into infinite spiderweb fractures. Yet, Takumi's towering avatar failed to shift a single micrometer. The intruder's forward vector was completely, flawlessly gridlocked, entirely incapable of advancing a single fraction of a millimeter. Subsequently, Takumi casually tightened his fingers. The manic, roaring laughter frozen instantly upon the behemoth's face, his massive features violently contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. The exact microsecond Takumi applied a fraction of his unamplified strength, the transmigrator felt the entirety of his hand bones crushed into absolute microscopic powder. Aff! The colossal intruder let out a high decibel, blood-curdling shriek, his massive frame collapsing heavily onto his knees as dense beads of cold sweat aggressively erupted across his forehead. Through what formulation is a metric of this density possible? The transmigrator frantically swallowed a mouthful of saliva, his internal systems completely saturated by pure horror. It hurt to an unimaginable, agonizing degree. Yet, scrutinized against the visceral physical trauma, what drove his neural paths into a state of absolute, freezing terror was the reality that his planetary tier code had been completely neutralized within a literal fraction of a microsecond. His entire dominant arm had been permanently deleted from the combat grid before he could even register the block, leaving his vessel entirely devoid of defensive countermeasures. This violates the primary source code. According to our surveillance files, shouldn't the absolute apex powerhouse of the enemy sector index strictly at the continental tier? An anomaly possessing the capacity to project a terminal threat against my signature should flatly never clear the gateway. That wretched woman Mio actually fed our faction a corrupted intelligence brief. Infinite rows of frantic, chaotic thoughts flashed through his cognitive centers within a millisecond, but the agonizing physical friction quickly short-circuited his capacity to think. Curse you to hell. Even assuming my life code is scheduled for permanent extraction, my vanguard shall forcefully drag your soul down alongside my vessel. A feral, thoroughly crazed expression populating his features, the giant intruder unleashed a desperate roar, violently swinging his remaining left fist with the absolute entirety of his residual kinetic reserves. A monstrous shockwave condensed around his knuckles, screaming straight toward Takumi's face. You absolute son of a bitch. My blade shall sunder your code. I'll erase your entire sector. Takumi calmly monitored the reality where the intruder's remaining arms and legs had been systematically, clinically shattered by his precise counters, leaving the brute half-dead and bleeding out on the broken floor. His ice-blue irises failed to register a single ripple of emotional variation. It was nothing more than a minor, low-tier garbage asset entirely unworthy of being archived in his databanks. At this milestone, the giant transmigrator's forehead was completely saturated with dense, freezing sweat, his optical sensors beginning to blur as his consciousness loops sustained critical errors. Deep, unmitigated despair flooded his soul code, his life force had been degraded by more than half, and his analytical mainframes verified with absolute certainty that his terminal deletion was an unalterable constant. Within a literal blink of an eye, before an authentic, high-intensity multiversal war could even initialize its first phase, the entire existential threat had seamlessly evaporated into thin air. The realization of power Shiori Itsuka stared blankly at the visceral scene unrolling before her coordinates, her entire psychological framework permanently locked in a state of absolute disbelief. Constitutes the definitive conclusion of a planetary tier raid. Granted, Her cognitive firewalls had previously computed that the multiversal vanguard must command an exceptional tier of power after all, lacking a reality-breaking parameter mass. How could they ever hope to permanently freeze a global space-time macrofusion? Yet, her wildest simulations had flatly failed to forecast that the enemy would scale this thoroughly pathetic. This transaction wasn't a standard high-tier martial engagement, this was an absolute, dimension-cleaving masterclass in total, unmitigated crushing. The two entities flatly failed to occupy the same evolutionary universe. Evaluating a metric of this preposterous density, Messenger genuinely possesses the absolute authority to flawlessly strip the system from my soul. Shiori Itsuka calculated frantically, her chest heaving with pure, unadulterated excitement. My office had scarcely initialized the roadmap to hunt down their locations, yet the target node has proactively delivered its own vessel straight to our doorstep. It has bypassed an immense volume of administrative friction, Takumi vocalized smoothly, a faint, highly satisfied smile gracing his features. He was indisputably navigating an exceptionally splendid mood. The surrounding Vanguard members concurrently unrolled a succession of composed nods. Beholding this preposterous display of casual omnipotence, Kurumi Tokisaki found herself completely, hopelessly dumbfounded. She carefully swallowed a mouthful of saliva, cold sweat aggressively bleeding across her delicate brow. My lord. Your cohort genuinely commands a terrifying capacity to execute a total world-play loop. The sheer environmental gravity paraded by that giant intruder moments ago was more than dense enough to forcefully crush her own unamplified vessel with a solitary finger. That was an absolute, undeniable data point. Had Takumi's towering silhouette refrained from anchoring the front line, the Itsuka infrastructure alongside the absolute totality of the surrounding municipal sector would have been permanently wiped from the server on this afternoon. Furthermore, running the structural equations governing this parallel world line, through what mechanical law was a powerhouse of that planetary magnitude even permitted to manifest? Kurumi Tokisaki suddenly captured an intense, chilling realization. The native reality she had spent centuries navigating had transitioned into an entirely unfamiliar, terrifyingly unmapped server. Curse your name, you absolute, logic-defying monster. The giant transmigrator wheezed heavily, his shattered limbs pinned uselessly against the concrete as absolute, unvarnished terror completely overrode his residual pride. Every single strike he had authorized across the engagement had constituted an absolute, definitive desperation payload engineered to execute a total trade yet, tracking the causal flowchart. His vessel had been systematically countered for consecutive times until his arms and legs were completely scrap data. The structural trauma was secondary. What ruthlessly short-circuited his pride was the empirical reality that even as he attacked with a total willingness to embrace permanent deletion, the silver-haired entity standing opposite his coordinates had preserved an entirely casual, bored expression from the initialization to the terminal millisecond of the sequence. This realization drove his logical units to the absolute verge of madness. To an arrogant apex predator who had long reigned supreme across lower dimensions, there existed zero scenarios more thoroughly suffocating than his current gridlock. Commanding a glorious planetary tier classification, yet pinned inside a minor, low-tech world line, he flatly lacked the basic capacity to mount a wisp of resistance. Takumi completely declined to return a verbal response. His processing units flatly refused to waste bytes answering the queries of an inferior asset. Staring indifferently down at the broken, bleeding frame of the transmigrator, his voice unrolled a perfectly calm, ice-cold demand: disclose the parameters. At what exact geographic coordinates are the remaining transmigrator nodes currently hiding? Chapter 185, Chapter 185. The Omniscient Mind Read, and the Silent Gathering of Flame 1564 words. Do you honestly believe my terminal will disclose that data to your sector? You have thoroughly sundered my physical shell, yet your presence expects absolute cooperation. The giant intruder let out a bitter, miserable chuckle. Pinned beneath an absolute death sentence, his residual stubbornness refused to yield. Takumi offered a slow, composed nod. From a primitive psychological standpoint, that does present a baseline layer of logic. Intimately parsing Takumi's reflective tone, the massive brute felt a wave of secret euphoria ripple through his firewalls. Calculating a potential window for negotiations, he gritted his teeth, and wheezed. However, it is far from mathematically impossible for my account to unroll the files. Provided your station unseals a localized trade, Takumi nodded thoughtfully, smoothly cutting through his voice with absolute clarity. Excluding your signature, your transmigrator squad hosts exactly 3 other active nodes, correct? Let my sensors map out the flowchart. Your cohort captured the Mio Takamiya, who transmigrated past your native server, along with the native Mio Takamiya directing this world line. Your team forcefully compressed their core energetic parameters to serve as the structural anchor for a massive spatial wormhole, aggressively pulling the 2 parallel Earths into a forced macrofusion. To successfully engineer a space-time anomaly of that caliber, it appears your companions possess highly refined utility skills. The giant intruder stood completely frozen, his features violently drained of all color. His eyes widened as he stared blankly up at Takumi, copious amounts of freezing sweat aggressively cascading down his forehead. What on earth is wrong with this monster's diagnostic tools? My vocal arrays haven't unrolled a single byte of data yet. Could it be that this silver-haired entity preserved absolute visibility tracking our entire operation from the very beginning, and merely intended to use a verbal interrogation loop to mock my pride? Parsing the brute's psychological breakdown, Takumi's countenance remained an absolute mask of serene tranquility. He calmly pursued the query, his tone completely flat. Disclose the parameters, at which specific coordinates are the remaining 3 transmigrators anchored, and what precise power tiers do their metrics register? My terminal has already initialized its stance. I flatly declined to unroll the logs. The giant brute gritted his teeth. Although an immense wave of existential dread continuously flooded his cognitive firewalls, he forced his fractured ego to maintain its resistance. So your collective base of operations is situated directly within the central headquarters of the DEM Corporation, Takumi vocalized softly, perfectly translating the thoughts bleeding from the intruder's mind. Fascinating. The Isaac Westcott and Ellen Mira Mathers native to this specific world line have already been systematically executed by your vanguard. Across the remaining 3 assets, 2 command parameters that completely outscale your own planetary tier. Your Supreme Captain possesses an absolute classification indexing at the Galaxy tier. Evaluating the data ledger, it appears your squad has successfully harvested and devoured an immense volume of multiversal world origins. Takumi's tone registered a minor, highly defined wisp of genuine surprise. It was a development that mildly bypassed his initial calculations. Galaxy tier combat mass. No wonder a rogue syndicate of this nature possessed the spatial authority to authorize a planetary macrofusion. Had his primary consciousness declined to personally step past the space-time gateway on this cycle, leaving the mission payload exclusively to the unamplified attributes of Esteth, and the others, the Vanguard would have undoubtedly sustained severe operational friction attempting to resolve the anomaly. Monitoring Takumi's clinical, effortless parsing of his squad's deepest core secrets, the solitary shred of strategic leverage the intruder had hoped to wield was instantaneously, brutally shattered into microscopic dust. He frantically swallowed a dry lump of absolute terror, his inner soul completely overwhelmed by a crushing wave of total powerlessness. Please. My lord, does your station preserve any alternative queries? Provided your presence commands further data, unroll the prompt immediately. My terminal guarantees absolute transparency. I will disclose every single byte of intelligence without omitting a solitary file. Satoru Gojo remained silent. Boa Hancock offered no words. Shirori Itsuka stared blankly. Kurumi Tokisaki froze in place. The visual receptors of the onlookers twitched subtly as they audited the surreal scene, their gazes involuntarily locking onto Takumi's towering figure. Good heavens! Since your advanced mind-reading subroutines had already flawlessly harvested the complete database, through what purpose did your vocal arrays deliberately simulate a standard interrogation loop? To completely shatter a planetary-class Titan's psychological framework within a mere handful of sentences, could this track as an exceptionally twisted, malicious bad taste paraded by our newest group companion? My apologies, my office currently logs 0 residual queries targeting your account, Takumi vocalized with a mild, deeply serene smile, completely unfazed by the brute's desperate capitulation. Through the absolute execution of his mind-reading capabilities, He had already flawlessly cloned the entirety of the intruder's memory database. The biological asset resting on the floor had officially transitioned into useless garbage data. That pristine, terrifyingly calm smile constituted the definitive terminal frame captured by the intruder's optical sensors. Takumi casually raised his right hand. Locked beneath the stunned, paralyzed gaze of the giant transmigrator, a crisp, resonant fingersnap echoed through the ruined pavilion. Within a single chronological tick, the massive, 2-meter-tall planetary tier frame was seamlessly, instantly dissolved into a scattering pile of absolute gray ash. Meanwhile, deep within the primary executive director's office penthouse inside the DEM Corporation headquarters, the exact space-time microsecond Yang Debon's lifecycle code was completely erased from the multiversal registry. A cold female voice abruptly detonated, shattering the freezing silence governing the pristine corporate suite. Captain, Yang Debon's signature has sustained a total deletion loop. He is permanently dead. Stationed opposite the woman's coordinates, the squad captain, Xiao Xiao, leisurely unsealed his dark irises, his gaze entirely declining to track her physical silhouette. Permanently erased. An unexpected deviation. The telemetry parameters indicate a severe anomaly. Granted, Yang Debon's cognitive processors were severely unrefined, but his baseline combat mass firmly occupied the absolute planetary tier. Through what operational bottleneck could his vessel fail to execute a basic escape routine? According to the data packets harvested from Mio Takamiya, shouldn't the absolute peak power constraint dominating this server terminate strictly at the continental tier? The sudden destruction of her companion failed to initialize a single wisp of authentic grief across the woman's emotional firewalls. Instead, her vocal arrays delivered the analysis to Xiao Xiao with an undercurrent of sharp, mocking cynicism. The explanation requires minimal computing power, either that local spirit deliberately injected corrupted parameters to deceive our squad, or her unrefined scanners flatly lacked the capacity to map the server's true boundaries. Another young man standing adjacent to their coordinates commented indifferently. Yang Debon has already been cleared from the board. Wasting processing power on historical variables yields zero strategic utility currently, Xiao Xiao articulated, his expression an absolute pool of calm tranquility. Pinned beneath their shared perspective, the deceased brute didn't scale to a legitimate companion at all. This represented standard behavioral coding for their kind. They existed strictly as transmigrators, profoundly self-centered, ego-driven organisms, whose internal firewalls completely declined to archive an ounce of authentic empathy regarding the survival metrics of peer assets. The macroscopic layout governing the adjacent world line has completely outscaled our initial simulations. The data explicitly verifies that a powerful, third-party multiversal faction has forcefully intervened across the vectors of this server. Under an environmental variance of that density, encountering a tactical accident is far from an anomaly. Our primary operational directive currently demands we cease auditing how these interdimensional intruders cleared the firewall. Instead, our mainframes must rigorously guarantee their presence fails to disrupt our primary roadmap. The absolute extraction and consumption of this world server's origin source code must clear the gate with 0% tolerance for failure. Xiao Xiao's pupils flickered with a cold, calculating light as his processors mapped out the next strategic sequence. Even assuming that Xiao Xiao wielded a magnificent galaxy-tier power rating across his profile, his software completely lacked the reckless stupidity to delude itself into calculating that he could comfortably crush the entire infinite multiverse without strategic friction. In raw reality, any transmigrator node possessing the structural grit to successfully scale their attributes to a cosmic tier of this magnitude was guaranteed to operate as an exceptionally dangerous, hypervigilant mastermind. The absolute structural metrics governing the enemy vanguard remained entirely unmapped. Although his probability matrices returned a high likelihood that the intruders lacked a parallel galaxy-class Titan among their rows, launching a blind, head-on offensive campaign was entirely too careless. What if an unmapped variable breached his defenses? What if his entire life cycle catastrophically capsized inside an unverified gutter? Zhang Luo, my central command preserves absolute confidence tracking your specialized strength and spatial abilities. Your unit shall spearhead the primary intercept vector, initiating a high-intensity skirmish to rigorously test the baseline parameters of that incoming group. Xiangji and my own mainframe shall continuously anchor the rear coordinates, perfectly primed to deploy high-tier tactical support from the dark shadows. Understood, Captain. The young man designated as Zhang Luo nodded sharply. His irises instantaneously transmuted into an active, churning sea of cosmic fire, boundless elemental flames violently erupting out from his cellular framework. Sundering his physical outline, he compressed his mass into a brilliant streak of pure thermal energy, vanishing completely from the penthouse without leaving a single trace behind. Chapter 186, Chapter 186, The Eager Renunciation of the Cheat, and the Stellar Vice 1778 words. Inside the Itsuka residence, the heavy silence broke as Takumi effortlessly dissolved the planetary tier transmigrator into absolute gray ash. Having clinically witnessed the boundless, dimension-cleaving authority commanded by Takumi's towering silver-haired avatar, Shiori Itsuka felt the last of her strategic doubts completely evaporate. She believed in his divine mission implicitly. Messenger, I humbly implore your presence to aggressively, flawlessly recycle my system this exact microsecond. Shiori Itsuka bent her waist, unrolling a profound, deeply respectful bow toward Takumi. No outside observer could ever truly compute the immense, suffocating layer of resentment her cognitive firewalls had archived against her personal cheat software. Granted, the program designated itself as the family system, but scrutinized under her real-world experiences, it treated her family strictly as unrefined meat shields and generic harvesting tools to artificially inflate her baseline power metrics. It routinely demanded her vessel drag her loved ones into brutal, multi-dimensional execution loops to wage war against foreign syndicates. Through what logical stretch did a predatory mechanism of that description deserve to be classified as a sacred family bond? Across consecutive years navigating this world server, Shiori Itsuka had fully integrated into her active identity, completely embracing Kodori Itsuka as her genuine, deeply beloved little sister. Kodori represented the absolute apex priority anchoring her entire life cycle. She would gladly choose total deletion before ever permitting a corrupt, parasitic system to exploit her sibling's lifeline. The cooperative renunciation my database had predicted this transaction would require an extensive, highly complex negotiation phase. However, tracking your immediate compliance, is your soul truly prepared to decouple from the matrix? Takumi questioned smoothly. Without displaying a single wisp of hesitation or material regret, Shiori Itsuka proudly raised her open palm, her voice exploding with absolute, unvarnished sincerity. Unconditionally. Strip the data payload from my soul immediately. Beholding her hypercooperative posture, the facial muscles of the surrounding multiversal vanguard subtly twitched in unison. They were intimately aware of how profoundly game-breaking and logic-defying a transmigrator's system cheat truly scaled across the ledger it operated as an absolute, balance-shattering exploit. While their logical subroutines could fully sympathize with Shiori's moral boundaries, watching a transmigrator frantically, desperately push her own supreme cheat script straight out of her system felt entirely surreal. Yet, despite the inherent irony of the layout, realizing that the core objective could be seamlessly achieved without a high-intensity skirmish allowed the group companions to quietly breathe a collective sigh of relief. Evaluating their historical deployments across foreign sectors, this indisputably tracked as the absolute smoothest system reclamation loop they had ever initialized since they began hunting transmigrators. Right dead center at that precise chronological milestone, a catastrophic, sky-rending explosion violently detonated outside the ruined threshold, instantly shattering their train of thought. A wave of arrogant, wildly booming laughter aggressively sliced through the atmospheric shockwave to saturate their ears. Bow your heads to greet the arrival of Zhang Luo, vice-captain of the elite Falcon team. The descent of the solar blazes. Beyond the shattered remains of the outer courtyard, Zhang Luo stood proudly suspended in the open void, his physical framework completely enveloped within an immense, churning ocean of brilliant cosmic fire. Boundless rows of celestial blazes aggressively consumed the upper atmosphere, tinting the darkened sky in a violent sheet of blinding thermal energy. He cast a deeply condescending, squinted gaze straight down toward the dense architectural layout of the municipal sector, mimicking a proud, omnipotent deity surveying a cluster of insignificant terrestrial ants. The vanguard cohort. Exactly what manner of structural madness is executing across the server's transmigrator network on this afternoon? Our columns haven't even mobilized our strategic mass to aggressively liquidate your corporate base of operations inside the DEM headquarters, yet your personnel proactively deliver their own lifeline straight to our target zone. Are the transmigrator assets navigating the multiverse this year collectively formatted to be this exceptionally hard-headed? The hidden powerhouses directing that unmapped, third-party syndicate are clustered right down within that primitive structure, correct? Through what equation does your entire cohort remain frozen inside when my presence has unrolled such a spectacular, sky-tearing display of raw thermal mass? Could it be that your fragile frames are running severe survival panic, too terrified to even scan my outline? Conceal yourselves like cowards, then. Zhang Luo hovered grandly amidst the burning air currents, his wild chuckles echoing relentlessly. His high-profile, hyper-arrogant behavioral matrix was simply preposterous. However, running a technical audit of his telemetry data, he indisputably possessed the raw baseline parameters to justify his immense pride. As the recognized vice-captain of the Falcon Transmigrator Syndicate, a highly specialized collective of rogue dimension travelers, his core attributes proudly checked in at the absolute stellar tier. Setting aside the unenhanced civilian populations inhabiting this local data live server, even assuming the twin parallel Earths achieved absolute, flawless macrofusion directly before his visual fields, the combined mass scaled to nothing more than a minor toy that his unreserved combat output could easily delete within a single move. Even if his primary directives demanded the absolute, atomic destruction of a massive macrostar, provided his system was granted a brief chronological window to execute the calculation, his unyielding stellar-class kinetic fire would effortlessly clear it from the galactic database. An existence commanding an evolutionary register of this terrifying density was structurally indistinguishable from an authentic, living god when pinned against a lower-tier world server. To his global matrix, every single asset navigating this plane was an absolute garbage tier waiting to be processed as free merits, the solitary exceptions marking a threat threshold being his own supreme captain, Xiao Xiao, or the sovereign system operators. The rest of the multiverse was strictly given for free. The strong naturally preserve the unyielding, absolute arrogance expected of an apex predator. Even assuming this mysterious third-party intervention force possessed the localized tactical mass to successfully terminate Yang Deben, who had merely occupied a low-grade planetary tier index, what wisp of strategic anxiety was that supposed to introduce to his firewalls? Yang Deben had sustained a permanent deletion loop simply because his individual attributes were entirely too pathetic. Zhang Luo was a fundamentally altered variable. His processing cores maintained an absolute, ironclad confidence. He was thoroughly, perfectly convinced that by unleashing the unmitigated density of his stellar tier blazes, he could easily, ruthlessly flatten Takumi and the entire vanguard into macroscopic stardust. Cross swords the evaluation of the vanguard. Down on the fractured concrete, the elite group companions exchanged a succession of highly amused, entirely unnatural expressions. Good heavens! This burning insect is genuinely, blindingly brave. So completely self-assured, so spectacularly loud-mouthed. Does his primitive system harbor even a microscopic wisp of data tracking exactly what manner of multiversal primordial titan is currently standing right next to our boots? His vocal arrays broadcast an exceptionally loud script, yet his underlying thermal emission metrics verify a legitimate tier of baseline capabilities. Esteth snorted ice-coldly, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she calibrated her tracking modules. Far from parading a wisp of strategic carelessness, her irises burned with an immediate, calculating intensity. The raw atmospheric weight bleeding from the incoming transmigrator was an absolute parameter that even Esteth was programmatically compelled to validate across her ledger. The intruder registered as a magnificent powerhouse who scaled closely alongside her own current optimized limits. Furthermore, his signature verified his status as an active transmigrator. Even for an elite asset of her calibers, engaging a target of this classification demanded her system initialize its highest tier of tactical vigilance. Granted, his output tracks at a highly defined, impressive density. But analyzing the overarching corporate layout, his terminal completely fails to reach our pay grade, doesn't it? Satoru Gojo vocalized with absolute, relaxed nonchalance, casually leaning his head back as he deep-scanned the sky. Exactly how many seconds do you all calculate his code can comfortably survive the loop if our boss decides to execute a standard hard wipe? Stellar tier combat mass, is it? This uncle's processing units were just desperately craving to decode the exact physical boundary separating my current vector calculations from a star-class energy output. Accelerator hissed, his crimson irises gleaming with a hypervolatile, borderline psychotic malice. Having his magnificent presence ridiculed and screamed at twice in a row by arrogant transmigrators riding straight on his face had completely, permanently short-circuited his internal patience loops. He was exceptionally displeased. Boa Hancock scanned the aggressive, sky-blotting sea of fire roaring across the firmament. Intimately processing the empirical data fields, her software calculated that her unamplified parameters failed to hold a favorable probability layout against a direct star-level engagement. Maintaining her elegant, completely serene composure, she gracefully shifted her position toward the perimeter. This concubine shall peacefully anchor the side vectors to observe the deployment. Kurumi Tokisaki. The psychological profiles of both sides were entirely beyond her capacity to compute. Her analytical subroutines ran a real-time simulation of the upcoming clash, the absolute, raw kinetic aftermath bleeding from a high-intensity confrontation. Balancing these monsters against a star-class transmigrator would be more than dense enough to instantly, ruthlessly vaporize her unenhanced spirit shell from the multiversal map. Driven by an absolute biological survival reflex, Kurumi Tokisaki quietly, smoothly shifted her delicate frame, pressing her silhouette as closely as possible against Takumi's towering, majestic outline. The authorization for battle, very well. Treat this encounter as a brief introductory warm-up loop to comfortably calibrate your optimized attributes, Takumi vocalized serenely via Sephiroth. Sensing the immense, hyper-intense battle drive agitating the energy fields around his death, an accelerator, he held zero desire to dismantle their competitive momentum. Offering a composed nod to his combat assets, his voice unrolled the definitive split directive: my office shall concurrently focus on finalizing the extraction and reclamation of the Itsuka family system. Are you genuinely planning to refrain from initializing a direct personal intervention? Kurumi Tokisaki's voice contained a highly defined wisp of frantic concern, her irises wide as she monitored the sky. The blazing entity anchoring the firmament appears to command an exceptionally dangerous threat index. Think nothing of it. Its death and accelerator are more than dense enough to comfortably, safely neutralize a baseline node of that classification, Takumi responded with a perfectly calm, reassuring chuckle. Since their internal gears are burning with such an intense desire to test their growth against the multiverse, my station possesses zero structural reasons to restrict their parameters. Kurumi Tokisaki. Absorbing his casual, absolute dismissal of a planet-melting deity, the spirit of time silently, completely retreated into the deep shadow cast by Takumi's towering frame, locking her vital metrics into a state of total reliance as she sought complete sanctuary beneath the sovereign's presence. Chapter 187, Chapter 187, System Decoupling, and the Mandate of the Divine Enforcers. 1495 words. Is death and accelerator exchanged a swift, knowing glance. With a brief nod toward the rest of the cohort, they ignited their respective spatial pathways and rocketed out of the ruined pavilion, charging toward the blazing firmament. Watching their forms dissolve into the high air currents, Takumi turned his silver-haired head back to Shiori Itsuka. The unvarnished weight of his steady stare carried an implicit command. Shiori Itsuka nodded numbly. Deep within her internal processors, an immense wave of pure curiosity still flickered. She desperately wondered how exactly Takumi intended to strip away the god-level family system from her consciousness. After all, across consecutive years on this world server, her terminal had initiated countless decoupling subroutines, yet every single independent attempt had met with absolute failure. Her calculations had long since concluded that only a total, permanent destruction of her biological vessel could ever unbind the predatory software from her soul code. The subsequent microsecond, an unimaginable, logic-defying agony violently detonated deep within her brain case. Shiori Itsuka froze for a single compressed fraction of a heartbeat before her knees collapsed beneath her weight. She crashed heavily onto the ruined floorboards, an absolute, high-decibel shriek of pure torment tearing straight through her vocal arrays. Aya! It hurts so much. Hold your processors. It's burning, it's burning. Beholding her violent thrashing, Boa Hancock lowered her gaze, questioning Satoru Gojo in a soft, elegant murmur. Excuse me, does your database comprehend the precise mechanics executing across her framework? It should map to a live system extraction loop, correct? Satoru Gojo replied casually, his blindfolded countenance tracking the localized energetic shifts. In unvarnished reality, his advanced scanners lacked precise telemetry detailing Takumi's exact decoupling methodologies, but the conceptual blueprint was elementary enough. Throughout historical deployments, whenever the Overlord or his proxies initialized a system recovery protocol, they simply deleted the rogue transmigrator node first before extracting the code from the remaining gray ash. Executing a live extraction directly from a functional, breathing host is a completely unprecedented operational format. However, since our supreme boss is personally handling the sequence, there is absolute zero probability of a system failure. Every single byte of the dialogue exchanged between Boa Hancock and Satoru Gojo was flawlessly captured by Kurumi Tokusaki's hyper-refined auditory filters. Although her analytical mainframes still lacked the core meta-knowledge to decode the full scale of the transaction, her processors successfully archived infinite rows of high-value intelligence blocks. Takumi maintained absolute silence, his complete processing focus anchored on regulating the volatile strings within Shirori Itsuka's neural matrix. The pain, it's tearing me apart. My code is going to be permanently deleted. I'm going to die, I'm going to The pain vanished. Shirori Itsuka's frantic screams abruptly ceased. Within the span of a few brief breaths, her erratic vital metrics miraculously stabilized, and the agonizing friction completely cleared from her system. A magnificent, shimmering purple radiance fluidly escaped from her biological vessel, hovering momentarily in the air before seamlessly submerging into Takumi's outstretched palm. Having ceased her shrieking, Shirori Itsuka dazedly massaged her temples before slowly pushing her frame off the floorboards. The software, is it genuinely, completely wiped from my registry? Her cognitive firewalls struggled to process the sudden return to baseline reality. Deep scanning her internal consciousness loops, she isolated absolute zero traces of that cold, mechanized system voice. Realizing the total success of the extraction, she practically vaulted off the ground in pure, unadulterated ecstasy. It's gone. It's finally, flawlessly gone. Shirori Itsuka erupted into a wave of unbridled, joyful laughter, completely vacant of the typical psychological despair or sense of loss an ordinary asset would display upon forfeiting a supreme multiversal cheat. Instead, she lunged forward, tightly clasping Takumi's armored hands as her vocal arrays overflowed with frantic gratitude. Thank you. Oh magnificent Mr. Messenger, my station extends its absolute, deepest gratitude to honor your presence. Restrain your appreciation subroutines for the present phase, Takumi countered smoothly, giving a slow, gentle shake of his silver-haired head. Granted, your soul has been successfully decoupled from the parasitic system, yet the foundational data variable remains unchanged. Your profile still indexes within our databases as an illegal transmigrator. By all standard administrative protocols, my office is required to translocate your vessel straight back to your ancestral origin world. Illegal transmigrator? Hearing the completely unmapped terminology, Shirori Itsuka tilted her head in profound confusion. The remaining Vanguard companions similarly pricked up their auditory arrays to harvest the data. To break down the parameters in elementary terms, your presence completely lacks anything resembling legal interdimensional travel documentation. Your lifecycle code is entirely unprotected by the primary will of this world server. In unvarnished reality, your vessel tracks as a multiversal stowaway. Ergo, authorizing a total deportation routine to restore you to your native coordinates is the strictly logical output, is it not? Hearing his clinical breakdown, Shirori Itsuka's joyful expression instantaneously froze, her features masking over with deep, unyielding reluctance. Having navigated this world line for successive decades, her psychological frameworks had long since synchronized with the local environment. She had built an unbreakable life alongside Kotori Itsuka. Forced to leave everything behind and return to her past mundane existence, her system flatly refused to accept the update with a happy heart. Multiversal Intel Stream Umaradoma, Through what equation did my database fail to flag the existence of legal documentation metrics regarding world line transit? Shinobu Kocho, indeed. Lord Takumi has completely refrained from unrolling data blocks of that density across our historical interactions. Saitenshi, to think that even the concept of legal travel documentation can be systematically managed through cross-world transit, the scale of the cosmos is truly magnificent. Sosuke Aizen, I see. The overarching simulation blueprint has officially finalized its calculation within my processors. Nagato Uzumaki, Mr. Aizen, exactly what manner of tactical insight has your terminal decoded? Sosuke Aizen, throughout my historical tenure inside this channel, my mainframes have continuously wrestled with a singular query. Why does our Supreme Lord Sovereign display such boundless, preposterous generosity, effortlessly endowing our fragile mortal vessels with reality-breaking power tiers? At this precise space-time intersection, the absolute answer has cleared the gateway. Ingzheng, Mr. Aizen's deductions align perfectly alongside my own structural models. My office has similarly analyzed this specific transaction. Granted, our congregation has routinely organized grand sacrifices featuring holy livestock and sacred grains to honor the divine altar, yet scrutinized under a strict law of equal exchange, those primitive materials are entirely worthless, completely incapable of balancing the infinite cosmic authority the sovereign has graciously accredited to our ledger. Sosuke Aizen, His Highness Ingzheng has isolated the exact core variable. Analyzing the telemetry logs, although Sephiroth has merely cleared the group gateway on this current cycle, his status as a devoted believer under the sovereign long predates our own integration timelines. Extracting the subtext from his verbal strings, my processors have isolated a magnificent probability. The core directive driving our Lord to empower our stations is to format our cohort to serve as the supreme enforcers of cosmic order, permanently tasked with maintaining absolute peace across the myriad heavens and infinite realities. Setting aside the moral parameters defining an individual container, the literal existence of a system cheat houses an entirely too volatile, catastrophic hazard tier. A baseline mortal soul will inevitably cave to the corruptive allure of that unmitigated power, transforming into a malignant tumor that ruthlessly bleeds the origin code of their host world lines. Threat vectors of that tier must be systematically, ruthlessly eliminated. Yet, these unrefined, lower-dimensional garbage nodes are entirely unworthy of drawing the personal attention of our magnificent God. Ergo, the Sovereign has deliberately chosen to cultivate our parameters, transforming our frames into elite enforcers authorized to execute the divine cleanup protocols on his behalf to protect the divine kingdom, and all lower realities. Umaradoma, is that the absolute blueprint? So the true, hidden mind of the Supreme Sovereign operates on a scale of this magnificent density. Shinobu Kocho, this profound revelation instantly forces a classic paradigm to clear my memory files. The grander the baseline capability, the weightier the systemic responsibility. The cosmic authority wielded by our Lord Sovereign scales to such a preposterous register. It is entirely natural for His Majesty to shoulder a boundless mantle of existential preservation that our primitive minds fail to comfortably comprehend. To think that deep within unmapped dimensions where our sights can flatly never reach, the true God has been silently, seamlessly anchoring the absolute order of the myriad universes. Nagato Uzumaki, the reality-warping mana commanded by the true God proudly reigns supreme above the absolute apex of the firmament. Should His Majesty choose to decline this cosmic stewardship, not a single entity across the multiversal grid possesses the authority to compel His hand. The Sovereign operates with such boundless, magnificent compassion and world-saving mercy. His presence truly constitutes the ultimate, supreme blessing shielding all realities. Chapter 188, Chapter 188. The stellar 1673 words. Shiori Itsuka gathered her remaining courage and asked in a low, tentative tone, "Is there truly no alternative roadmap beyond these parameters?" Takumi offered a faint, tranquil smile through his Sephiroth avatar, his voice remaining perfectly serene. "Naturally, a secondary path exists. The most elementary method would be for your vessel to forcefully knock all of us down right here. If you achieve that outcome, you will naturally be exempted from returning to your ancestral server." Hearing his absolute mockery of a choice, Shiori Itsuka's lips violently twitched. Her cheeks flushed with a volatile cocktail of irritation and profound helplessness, an absolute wave of internal profanity thoroughly saturating her cognitive pathways. Are you serious? Your parameters scale to such a preposterous, logic-defying register. Exactly what defensive matrix could my unamplified vessel ever deploy to fight your presence? Do your processors even maintain a shred of baseline reality? Do you take me for an absolute fool? He had flawlessly flagged her hidden identity as an illegal transmigrator at a solitary glance, effortlessly stripped the Supreme System payload directly out from her soul matrix, and casually played with its core data parameters right inside his open palm. No matter how her analytical modules ran the numbers, this silver-haired entity was terrifyingly, omnipotently strong. Engaging in open combat with a literal multiversal immortal of his classification. That wasn't an authentic martial confrontation, it was a brutal masterclass in ruthlessly bullying a defenseless civilian child. Yet, driven exclusively by an unyielding, fanatical desire to protect Kotori Itsuka's survival metrics, Shiori Itsuka fiercely gritted her teeth, desperately attempting to negotiate for a superior transactional layout. Messenger, is there absolutely zero alternate trajectories beyond those two vectors? In response, Takumi subtly shifted his posture, his vocal parameters radiating a deeply comforting stability. In unvarnished reality, there is indeed a third operational choice. What exact choice tracks across your ledger? Shiori Itsuka's eyes instantaneously lit up, her internal panic firewalls closing down. You may bring Kotori Itsuka to formally integrate into my sect of the God of Creation, Takumi broken down smoothly. Although your container will be strictly prohibited from permanently residing within the geographic boundaries of this specific world server, your account will at least preserve the permanent administrative right to remain continuously alongside Kotori. Shiori Itsuka froze. Let her and Kotori formally enlist as consecrated followers inside the sect of the God of Creation. It wasn't that her system harbored a single shred of structural reluctance. However, even assuming her database completely lacked files tracking the structural nature of this mysterious cult, evaluating the logic-defying mass paraded by Takumi and his vanguard, it was indisputably a monumental, apex multi-universe conglomerate. Did an unrefined soul like hers even possess the basic quality to clear their baseline recruitment parameters? Pondering the variables for a brief microsecond, Shiori Itsuka gave a firm, unyielding nod of absolute submission. Provided my account preserves the permanent right to stay continuously alongside Kotori, any world server across the cosmos is perfectly fine by me. Splendid. Hearing her definitive surrender, Takumi extended his bare hand forward. Shiori Itsuka similarly extended her hand, locking down the transactional covenant. Calm at the high-altitude war zone. Meanwhile, high up within the fractured parameters of the firmament, the immense airspace centered directly around Zhang Luo's coordinates had mutated into a catastrophic, hyper-intense battlefield. The exact milestone is death, an accelerator initialized their intercept vector. Boundless spatial fractures and massive atmospheric rifts continuously sundered the air currents, the two opposing forces clashing with unmitigated, roaring violence that detonated continuous sonic booms across the server. Strictly running the technical parameters, both Zhang Luo and Esteth commanded a baseline combat mass capable of executing a total planetary deletion protocol with a single unreserved kinetic payload. The reason the surrounding municipal bedrock merely sustained interlaced fractures rather than the entire planet being blown to microscopic fragments flowed down to two specific structural laws. First, it was a testament to the exquisite, masterclass power control paraded by both combatants. The absolute totality of their raw energy was flawlessly, densely compressed to a solitary microscopic point before impacting the target, preventing any wasteful dissipation of kinetic mass. The crushing weight of their stellar-tier collisions was continuously absorbed straight by the opponent's physical framework. The structural stress received by the terrestrial surface below was nothing more than an insignificant peripheral shockwave. Second, both sides deliberately restricted their vector calculations from directly fracturing the planetary core. Unless pinned against an absolute, terminal dead end, no rational powerhouse would execute an action that foolishly deleted the host world line. While a total planetary explosion failed to introduce fatal trauma to damage a star-class vessel, navigating the absolute void of open cosmic vacuum remained an exceptionally hostile environment for a stellar-tier transmigrator. A stellar tier asset could comfortably hold their breath across immense chronological spans, or entirely bypass biological consumption arrays, but it failed to dictate that their systems completely outscaled basic physical needs. The desperation of the star, Aya. Curse your names. Damn it, damn it, damn it. You absolute multidimensional vermin. From what lawless corner of the multiverse did your cohort even clear the gateway? Right dead center at the apex of the roaring inferno, Zhang Luo's furious, hypervolatile roars relentlessly shattered the atmosphere. Pinned beneath the synchronized, high-intensity onslaught authorized by the vanguard elements, his posture completely lacked his introductory arrogance, his physical form was spectacularly, thoroughly embarrassed. It completely bypassed his predictive algorithms, totally, catastrophically unexpected. An authentic stellar-class entity operating alongside a force-multiplied planet-level monster. Through what computational logic can their unamplified parameters scale this preposterously strong? That wretched woman Mio Takamiya fed our faction a completely corrupted intelligence summary. Zhang Luo's current tactical situation tracked at an exceptionally bad register. His parameters explicitly verified that he was comprehensively gridlocked, entirely incapable of executing a basic escape subroutine even if his firewalls desperately panicked to clear the zone. Falling into an absolute structural disadvantage while losing the capacity to clear his coordinates left Zhang Luo drowning in an intense cocktail of raw misery, frantic rage, and profound helplessness. He had monumentally, fatally underestimated the unyielding combat mass commanded by these interdimensional intruders. If his supreme captain, Xiao Xiao, refrained from executing an immediate personal intervention loop to bail his signature out of the script, his lifecycle code was scheduled for permanent extraction right here on this afternoon. Zhang Luo continuously broadcasted high-priority emergency signals across his internal team channel, frantically begging his captain to launch a reinforcement deployment, while desperately spinning his attributes to deflect the joint offensive unrolled by his death, an accelerator. His crimson eyes burned like a venomous serpent, glaring viciously down at the vanguard assets as a wave of absolute, unmitigated ruthlessness saturated his processors. The literal microsecond our supreme captain clears his station to anchor this front, my blade shall systematically, ruthlessly settle every single line of this blood ledger. To his warped logic, the solitary reason this pathetic group could suppress his solar blazes flowed exclusively from their unrefined numerical advantage. The exact fraction of a second the galaxy-tier mastermind, Xiao Xiao, stepped onto the board, their catastrophic fates would be locked down. Extracting absolute vengeance would be an exceptionally elementary operation. Snowflake fire and water restraint, solar prominence blast. Monitoring the absolute sea of razor-sharp ice blades as death had materialized to saturate the entire geometric horizon, Zhang Luo let out an ice-cold snort. He violently condensed his physical matrix into a monumental pillar of cosmic fire, instantly vaporizing the sky-blotting crystalline storm into harmless vapor. While fire and water traditionally operated within a cycle of mutual elemental restraint, pinned against an explicit clash balancing solar fire against absolute ice, the former indisputably reaped a severe structural advantage. The intense thermal payload effortlessly melted the crystalline structures, forcefully stripping away the sharpness and hardness attributes governing the ice element. As the chronology of the skirmish ticked forward, the onlookers gradually isolated the underlying bottleneck. Concurrently speaking, although their side continuously retained the upper hand across the engagement, a tactical layout of this nature dictated that a solitary wisp of administrative negligence or a minor timing error could instantaneously invert the balance, potentially granting Zhang Luo the necessary space-time gap to successfully execute a flight sequence. What an absolute, unmitigated disgrace! Accelerator roared hoarsely. His silhouette instantaneously dematerialized from his coordinates, re-manifesting within a single chronological fraction directly in front of his death to forcefully, ruthlessly reflect a lethal thermal payload that had bypassed her guards. The absolute microsecond the two kinetic vectors violently collided, Accelerator's features underwent a sharp distortion. He felt his arms instantaneously drop into a state of immense, bone-crushing structural weight. Does your physical vessel preserve structural integrity? Death demanded, her brows knitting together as she scanned his form, noting how his absolute vector reflection had barely buffered the planetary melting shockwave. Purge the anxiety from your parameters, this uncle flatly refuses to sustain a terminal failure loop this easily, Accelerator rasped out through a mask of sheer irritation. Yet, deep within his internal processors, an intense wave of pure reluctance and frustration agitated his gears. Even leveraging the absolute reality warping backing of a high-tier divine artifact, attempting to challenge an authentic stellar-class transmigrator, while his native attributes merely indexed at a planet-level baseline introduced an entirely too preposterous processing friction. Had his death declined to anchor the absolute apex mass of the battlefield, relentlessly deploying her freezing laws to consume Zhang Luo's attention while permitting Accelerator to strictly focus on sudden, high-velocity intercept clashes, his vessel would have collapsed within a handful of seconds. Damn it, the absolute totality of my grand, apocalyptic threats have already been broadcasted onto the public feed. Are my systems genuinely going to be compelled to look like a pathetic fool, forced to beg that silver-haired newcomer to step forward and bail out my line? The tactical attacks formatting across his hands never faltered for a single millisecond, yet Accelerator couldn't restrain his inner pride from frantically thrashing against the layout. He fiercely loathed the concept of losing face before the cohort. Chapter 189, Chapter 189, The Delusional Star, and the Ultimate Spatial Intercept. 1740 words in strict terms, this represented the absolute first milestone where Accelerator had personally engaged in a high-intensity skirmish against an active transmigrator. Granted, his software had previously deployed to intercept hostile transdimensional anomalies back within the parameters of his native magical universe. However, during those historical cycles, his directive had been strictly formatted to safeguard Satoru Gojo and the unenhanced group assets. His vector fields had never directly clashed head-on against an optimized transmigrator node. Now that his physical vessel was intimately experiencing the absolute reality of a cosmic tier engagement, his processing units fully computed the sheer difficulty of the layout. Although his cognitive firewalls had long archived the theoretical constant that transmigrators were exceptionally dangerous entities to provoke, his scanners had lacked a precise, empirical metric. Pinned against the current reality, however, Accelerator was panting heavily, his respiratory subroutines heavily strained. Under an environmental gravity of this density, his systems lacked spare processing power to waste on trivial dialogue. An enemy who would have been flawlessly, ruthlessly deleted within a solitary millisecond had the primary deity chosen to authorize a standard administrative wipe was proving this monumentally exhausting to handle, even with his and Estetha's optimized attributes working in perfect synchronization. This grinding friction forced Accelerator to log a profoundly deeper, terrifying calculation tracking the true power tier commanded by the Sovereign. It was conceptually identical to a standard simulation matrix where the absolute maximum level cap was hard-coded at level 100, yet a majestic entity abruptly fractured the server framework, parading parameters that completely shattered all baseline limits. No matter how flawlessly an unenhanced mortal optimized their structural components, their ultimate terminal trajectory would strictly terminate at level 100. Yet, your mainframes would flatly never possess the diagnostic tools to decode whether the true god or his hidden alternate account operated at level 1000, or perhaps level 10,000. To summarize the tactical options, my system can strictly focus on maintaining maximum output. If the calculation hits an absolute bottleneck, even assuming my personal pride must sustain an embarrassing mark, my only choice will be to permit that silver-haired newcomer to initialize a hard wipe. Accelerator calculated silently, his teeth gritted. The perspective from the bedrock down on the fractured concrete below, Satoru Gojo, Boa Hancock, and Kurumi Tokisaki maintained an unyielding, hyper-focused vigil monitoring the apocalyptic clash running across the high atmosphere. Excluding the reality where Takumi had casually unsealed a fraction of his space-severing authority moments ago, this represented the absolute first milestone, where their visual receptors had scanned an existential threat profile of this absurd density with their own eyes. Had Estetha and Accelerator declined to actively anchor the front line, the remaining three assets would have been systematically, ruthlessly cleared from the board within a single breath. That wasn't an exaggerated hyperbole unrolled by their software, it was an absolute empirical constant echoing through their survival instincts. Maintain your pathetic struggling, you multiversal vermin. My blade shall aggressively extract absolute, blood-soaked vengeance from your entire column shortly. Suspended within the high air currents, Zhang Luo erupted into a succession of manic, wild chuckles, his facial features completely contorted into a feral mask of pure psychotic malice. His analytical modules verified that his unamplified solar blazes lacked the instantaneous output to comfortably crush these two enforcers, yet his cognitive firewalls fiercely refused to log the probability of his own defeat or permanent deletion. According to his calculations, these two active combatants indisputably represented the absolute apex military mass commanded by this incoming intervention force. In unvarnished terms, their syndicate completely lacked a high-tier Galaxy-class Titan otherwise. Through what logical equation would their units have permitted his presence to grandly leap across the firmament up to this present space-time milestone? The literal fraction of a microsecond his supreme Galaxy-tier captain stepped onto the board, every single interdimensional intruder navigating this plane would face permanent extraction. Absorbing that delightful strategic roadmap, the besieged transmigrator laughed even more grandly, his voice echoing relentlessly. Naturally, a catastrophic, high-intensity supernatural confrontation cascading directly above the Itsuka residence could flatly never mask its energy signatures from the local surveillance grids. The intelligence networks of every single relevant global department including the AST and the command bridge of Ratatosk instantly prioritized their tracking arrays, locking the absolute totality of their diagnostic focus onto this unmapped multiversal war. The Watchers in the shadows concurrently speaking, precisely as the two opposing kinetic masses were locked in a grinding deadlock, the supreme captain of the Falcon Transmigrator Syndicate, Xiao Xiao, alongside a secondary female operative designated as Xiangji, smoothly materialized at the perimeter. Refraining from carelessly closing the distance to compromise their stealth parameters, the two hidden entities meticulously anchored their coordinates within the deep shadows, deep scanning the battlefield. Captain, it appears Zhang Luo's solar attributes have run straight into a total, grinding stalemate alongside the enemy vanguard. His physical vessel looks spectacularly, thoroughly embarrassed. My internal processors are running a white noise error from pure amusement, Xiangji murmured, a sharp wave of cynical schadenfreude dancing across her features as she monitored his ragged movements. The parameters fail to align correctly, Xiao Xiao countered flatly, his facial features undergoing a sharp, hypertense contraction as his voice dropped into an urgent register. Concurrently verified. But the divergence flows exclusively from the reality that the enemy has deployed a localized numerical superiority. Even an asset commanding Zhang Luo's raw stellar tier density will inevitably sustain brief structural friction when pinned against a synchronized blitz, leaving his vessel temporarily stuck at a disadvantage. Looking at the current flowchart, those intruders desperately crave to permanently anchor his signature within this sector, yet their combined output lacks the capacity to finalize his deletion code. Xiangji paused, her processors mildly caught off guard by the intense wave of strategic anxiety suddenly bleeding from her captain's signature. She failed to comfortably decode his tension. Has your terminal failed to isolate the core anomaly? Xiao Xiao muttered, his irises flashing with an unpredictable, volatile light as his internal security systems redlined. He refused to permit his parameters an ounce of relaxation. Deep scanned the countenances of those onlookers lounging directly on the ground below. Their internal metrics flag absolute zero survival panic. Their irises are tracking the absolute end of a world line with the relaxed, completely detached posture of mortals watching a casual theater play. That tracks as an absolute constant. Guided by Xiao Zhao's diagnostic brief, Xiangji's scanners focused on the bedrock, her internal gears instantly jamming as she realized the horror of the layout. If the fighting elements anchoring the sky represented the absolute limits of the enemy's strategic mass, through what logic would the support assets on the floor parade an emotional register of this casual density? Exactly what manner of cosmic game was executing across this server? Did the two powerhouses dominating the high airspace genuinely constitute the absolute totality of the opponent's unsealed variables? Or rather was an unmapped, dimension-shattering anomaly seamlessly tracking their signatures from the pitch-black shadows? Xiao Zhao's cognitive centers spun through infinite, chaotic permutations. For an unverified reason, his survival subroutines were violently triggering a wave of profound, bone-chilling dread. An exceptionally bad premonition was aggressively rewriting his code. Bypassing any secondary calculation, his heart sank heavily as he turned to the maiden beside him, his voice unrolling an immediate, absolute command: abort the intercept vector. We are initializing an immediate emergency translocation to return to the base. Are our mainframes genuinely choosing to permanently abandon his vessel here, Captain? Completely blindsided by Xiao Zhao's abrupt retreat mandate, Xiang Ji's processing units sustained a temporary freeze, her vocal arrays broadcasting an instinctive query. My scanners have verified that the underlying layout is far from simple. Forcing a total retreat right here is the strictly optimal parameter required to guarantee our absolute safety, Xiao Zhao broken down clinically, his face hard. Furthermore, matching your own structural tracking, Zhang Luo's life code faces zero immediate lethality under the combined onslaught of those two enforcers. Even assuming our mainframes decline to distribute reinforcement payloads, he preserves more than enough hidden trump cards to manually break the combat lock and clear the zone. Our absolute primary directive currently demands we focus exclusively on accelerating the planetary macrofusion to violently plunder and devour this world server's origin source code, not to waste our processing resources waging a war of attrition against these interdimensional enforcers. Pinned against a strategic roadmap of that density, deploying Zhang Luo to serve as a passive sacrificial decoy to permanently tie down their primary combat assets while our mainframes execute the endgame is the most profitable play. The ultimate intercept. So the data unrolled a flowchart of that classification. The lines tracing Xiang Ji's features instantly cleared into a mask of pure, enlightened comprehension. She was programmatically compelled to admit that the strategic logic unrolled by her captain was beautifully, ruthlessly flawless. Your calculations are absolute, Captain. Securing the world line's origin source code remains our primary main quest payload. Let us clear these coordinates and translocate back immediately. The mathematical probability of Zhang Luo sustaining a terminal deletion loop under the current matrix was exceptionally small, allowing Xiang Ji to authorize the retreat file with zero internal friction. Deep within her private modules, she even secretly craved for the enemy enforcers to scale higher, forcing Zhang Luo to endure a brutal tier of physical trauma, so she could systematically mock his pride across subsequent cycles. However, the exact fraction of a second the final syllable cleared Xiang Ji's lips, a spectacularly calm, entirely tranquil voice abruptly populated the compressed airspace directly adjacent to her ears, causing the absolute totality of her biological framework to instantaneously lock down in a state of frozen, white noise horror. Are your profiles genuinely prepared to translocate back to your base currently? Hearing that majestic, reality-purifying acoustic mass, the irises of both Xiao Zhao and Xiang Ji violently, catastrophically contracted to their absolute structural limits. Turning their heads in unbridled, soul-shattering terror, their optical sensors locked straight onto the towering silhouette of Takumi, who had smoothly, flawlessly paced right out from a freshly torn spatial rift in the continuum. The boundless, universe-crushing cosmic pressure bleeding from his silver-haired presence instantaneously saturated their coordinates, forcefully compelling the two transmigrators to draw a sharp, agonizing breath of pure existential dread. The hidden variable had officially closed the gateway. Chapter 190, Cosmic Erasure, and the Fall of the Falcon. 1713 words rewinding the temporal sequence by a few minutes, while his death and accelerator were locked in a hyper-intense, grinding deadlock against the stellar tier transmigrator, Zhang Luo, Takumi's primary consciousness was meticulously monitoring every fluctuation of the battlefield. This engagement served as an essential combat trial for his death and accelerator. Unless their core lifelines hit an absolute dead end, Takumi held zero intention of casually intervening to steal their growth momentum. It would be an optimal development if the two of them could successfully neutralize Zhang Luo using their own optimized parameters. Yet, even if their calculation hit a total bottleneck, it was of minor consequence. Takumi was perfectly positioned to deploy a localized lockdown vector at any microsecond to ensure the target could flatly never execute a flight sequence. Strictly speaking, Zhang Luo's raw attributes indexed exceptionally high among standard star-class entities. Ergo, the reality that his death and accelerator had failed to cleanly finalize his deletion code within the opening phase was far from an anomaly. Conversely, had their unamplified baseline forms effortlessly flattened a stellar tier transmigrator right out of the gate, it would have been an immense, highly pleasant surprise even to Takumi's advanced calculations. The Death Squad Q, however, the exact millisecond Xiao Zhao and Xiang Ji materialized within the structural parameters of the war zone, Takumi's divine arrays smoothly shifted, instantly mapping out the macro anomaly. The final two transmigrator nodes have proactively converged onto the same coordinate axis. Takumi found himself mildly short-circuited by the pure absurdity of the layout. Exactly what manner of corrupted programming was directing the multiversal transmigrator network on this timeline? They were literally queuing up to be systematically purged. Like the Calabash brothers running a continuous loop to rescue their grandfather, simply delivering their lifelines one after another. Bypassing any necessity to track them down across the vast dimensional grid, these targets were actively organizing their own execution line directly before his scanners, even after explicitly verifying that a third-party intervention force dominated the server. The Falcon Syndicate. Evaluating their behavioral coding, they were structurally indistinguishable from a generic suicide squad. Takumi sighed helplessly. Giving a slow, silent shake of his silver-haired head, he calmly stepped forward, his form fluidly dissolving straight into a freshly unsealed spatial gateway. Snowflake the weight of cosmic eyes, or your profiles genuinely prepared to translocate back to your base currently. Returning to the active timeline, the moment Takumi's serene, reality-purifying voice violently detonated inside their acoustic arrays, the internal safety parameters of Xiao Xiao and Xiangji completely, catastrophically collapsed. Intimately tracking an intuitive bad premonition, Xiao Xiao had already resolved to abort the mission and execute an immediate emergency retreat. Yet, his predictive systems had flatly failed to compute that the structural intercept would execute with this terrifying velocity. The two transmigrators forcefully rerouted their visual tracking modules toward the source of the acoustic waves, their optical sensors instantly locking onto the towering, silver-haired figure who had seamlessly materialized out of the vacuum. Granted, evaluated at a superficial glance, Takumi's posture closely mirrored that of an unenhanced mortal civilian. However, even an asset with completely broken logical faculties would compute that an entity effortlessly clearing a high-tier spatial fracture could flatly never be categorized as a standard human container. Whether he actively registered Xiao Xiao's deep scan or not remained unverified across the ledger, yet, pinned beneath Xiao Xiao's optical sensors, it appeared as though Takumi's cold, ice-blue irises were slowly, relentlessly pivoting to track his exact coordinates. The literal millisecond Xiao Xiao's gaze directly collided against Takumi's presence, his internal stability modules sustained a total, crushing shutdown. Confronted by the silver-haired entity, his magnificent galaxy-tier mass felt completely indistinguishable from a microscopic ant permanently trapped beneath a logic-defying cosmic gravity that could forcefully, ruthlessly devour his entire existence within a single chronological fraction. He drew a sharp, agonizing breath of freezing air, his physical vessel involuntarily staggering 2 paces backward across the void as his facial features twisted into an exceptionally ugly mask of unadulterated dread. Exactly what manner of primordial multiversal monster was anchoring this coordinate? Commanding an absolute galaxy-tier classification, yet his system was entirely incapable of initializing a single wisp of defensive resistance. Xiao Xiao completely lacked data blocks to identify Takumi's true standing within the cosmic registry, but his core processors verified an absolute constant. His squad had just run straight into a terminal, irreversible catastrophe. This wasn't a distorted optical illusion generated by survival panic. His software had always preserved a unique, high-tier innate subroutine engineered explicitly to predict localized lethality bounds, and sense the raw attribute density of external assets, which was the absolute structural reason he had historically operated with such extreme, hypervigilant caution. Yet, despite deploying every single predictive shield and leaving infinite rows of safety margins across his roadmap, the supreme existential crisis had still ruthlessly bypassed his parameters to lock down his life cycle. The illusion of co-destruction. Since your vessels have proactively cleared the gateway to stand before my presence, abandon any delusional calculations regarding a successful flight sequence. Forfeit your lifelines and die in absolute, tranquil silence. Takumi casually, slowly raised his right arm, his voice vibrating with a perfectly serene, undisturbed tone, precisely as if his vocal arrays were refraining from broadcasting a terrifying death sentence, but merely stating a self-evident, unalterable physical constant of the universe. Desperately craving to finalize my deletion code. My blade flatly refuses to authorize an easy extraction loop. Xiao Zhao's countenance cycled through successive states of frantic, chaotic distortion. The instant the final syllable cleared his lips, his system forcefully initialized a hidden fail-safe mechanism. Within a single chronological tick, infinite rows of hypercompressed conceptual protective shields violently erupted around his coordinates, tightly, flawlessly locking his signature and Xiangji behind an impenetrable absolute defensive matrix. Adhering strictly to his hypercautious behavioral programming, it was a mathematical impossibility for his office to navigate a foreign world line without archiving a succession of ultimate survival trump cards. To unroll an empirical data field, leveraging a structural defense configuration of this supreme density, even assuming the host planetary shell was completely, atomically pierced through by a high-yield cosmic beam, his life cycle parameters would comfortably survive the vacuum with zero cellular degradation. However, evaluating the actual flowchart of the transaction tracking the velocity of Takumi's incoming punch, Xiao audited the total, instantaneous collapse of his absolute protective layers. His pupils violently contracted into microscopic pinpricks, his psychological framework completely flooding with unmitigated confusion and absolute, soul-shattering disbelief. Hold your hand. Deactivate the strike and grant our vessels clearance to leave. Otherwise, every single living organism inhabiting this miserable planet shall be forcefully processed as absolute sacrificial burial weight to accompany our deletion. Your mainframes must preserve the data. My unyielding mass can effortlessly vaporize this entire planetary sphere with a solitary wave of my palm. Copious streams of freezing sweat aggressively cascaded down Xiao's forehead, his vocal arrays completely losing their structural dignity as he screamed frantically at Takumi. Release the spatial lock. Our squad guarantees we shall vacate this world server this exact microsecond. Otherwise, even assuming my life code is scheduled for permanent extraction, my system commands more than enough kinetic reserves to drag this entire civilization down into the grave alongside my vessel. Xiao roared insanely. His analytical units possessed zero data fields tracking Takumi's true alignment, but since their own primary main quest directive demanded the total destruction of the world line, any asset stepping forward to forcefully freeze their operation was programmatically categorized as a traditional guardian of the world. A righteous enforcer tasked with maintaining a world line's peace was universally hard-coded to prioritize civil preservation above personal victory. This represented the collective, exploitable design flaw common to all righteous figures. Xiao's irises flashed with a manic, thoroughly crazed light, desperately attempting to leverage this classic psychological exploit to seize a solitary, final probability of survival. The irrelevant variable nevertheless. The fist never faltered. That majestic, space-cleaving fist completely declined to alter its trajectory by a single fraction of a micrometer because of his frantic blackmail. It failed to display even a microscopic wisp of tactical hesitation. Xiao's frantic roars instantaneously froze dead inside his throat. Staring blankly up at the oncoming knuckles that physically, structurally seemed to expand until they completely blotted out the entire infinite sky, a solitary terminal thought remained running inside his cognitive center: absolute, permanent deletion. Reaching this desperate milestone, his firewalls frantically attempted to forcefully force a total, unreserved self-detonation loop to vaporize the entire planetary sector along with his coordinates, yet his processors brutally flagged a catastrophic error. For an unmapped, logic-defying reason, his internal energy matrices had been completely, flawlessly gridlocked by an absolute external law. He lacked the basic administrative authorization to even trigger his own self-destruction. Curse this writing. Unleashing a final, desperate roar of pure existential agony, Xiao fiercely stomped his feet against the vacuum. His features warped into a manic, thoroughly broken mask of pure madness as he forcefully threw the absolute entirety of his remaining kinetic mass straight into a suicidal, head-on collision against the descending fist. Since the spatial pathways were completely closed and escape was mathematically impossible, this solitary terminal clash would dictate the absolute boundary of life and death. Within a single compressed chronological tick, the supreme captain of the Falcon Transmigrator Syndicate was cleanly, permanently erased from the multiversal server, without leaving a single trace of his data behind. A primitive, unrefined galaxy-tier insect. Do your processors genuinely calculate that a signature of your pathetic definition is structurally qualified to negotiate terms alongside my presence? Having systematically deleted 2 high-threat transmigrators with a solitary, unamplified punch, Takumi calmly lowered his right arm, unrolling a deeply indifferent, contemptuous evaluation targeting the brute's terminal struggles. Concurrently speaking, although the physical vessels of the two intruders had been completely, flawlessly vaporized into absolute non-existence, the high-tier multiversal cheat systems anchoring their souls failed to vanish from the server. Following a precise, clinical extraction loop authorized by Takumi's primary authority, the two plugins were seamlessly stripped out from the remaining gray data, transforming into a pair of brilliant purple light streams that fluidly merged straight into Takumi's primary deity vessel. Chapter 191, Chapter 191, The Fall of the Galaxy Tier, and the Fading Sapphire Crystals. 1538 words, because the entity who had accepted the system mission was Takumi, the account directing the live structural broadcast was naturally Takumi as well. Consequently, the breathtaking sequence that had just unfolded across the space-time rift was witnessed flawlessly by every single member of the multiversal chat channel. Shinobu Kocho, as expected of a multiverse-tier powerhouse. His performance is truly magnificent. Umaradoma, mem. The conflict evaporated the exact instant he struck. Sephiroth is just too cool. Tony Stark, that transmigrator screaming, "It's not that easy to kill me," right before getting pulverized into cosmic dust. Ha ha ha, that completely cracked me up. Nagato Uzumaki, in fairness, I believe that transmigrator captain was exceptionally cautious. In terms of sheer vigilance, his strategic play was top tier. But the core problem is that when you run into an absolute anomaly like Senior Sephiroth, all the caution in the multiverse becomes utterly useless. Ingzheng, indeed. Although our data confirms these transmigrators aim to destroy worlds and plunder their origin source codes, watching the broadcast almost made me feel as if Mr. Sephiroth was the true, ultimate demon king. Every defensive measure they deployed was utterly futile before his absolute majesty. Umaradoma, right. It really gave off that vibe. But that's probably just the psychological illusion that happens when someone is so overwhelmingly powerful that the villains can't even glimpse a shred of hope. Snowflake: The Breaking of the Star. Back within the fractured parameters of the parallel world line. Having completely erased Xiao Xiao and Xiangji from the multiversal grid with a single punch, Takumi's features remained entirely serene. Although he refrained from actively opening his terminal to peek at the interface, he could deduce with his eyes closed that the chat channel was currently locked in a hyper-energetic discussion because of his deployment. Unsurprisingly, a monumental spatial shockwave of that density naturally reverberated straight across the other side of the high-altitude battlefield. Curse it all! How could this happen? Zhang Luo had completely shed his arrogant confidence. His physical vessel was heavily battered, his irises thoroughly bloodshot with unmitigated panic. The secondary planetary asset was gone. Xiangji, the female operative he fiercely loathed, was gone. Even their absolute leader, a galaxy-tier mastermind, had been permanently deleted from the server in a solitary instant. Though his analytical modules desperately struggled to compute the true nature of this nightmare, the unyielding reality left him thoroughly paralyzed. Seizing upon this structural lapse, Esteth and Accelerator unrolled a brutal, synchronized offensive, heavily wounding his framework in a single, flawless strike. Barely deflecting their continuous onslaught, Zhang Luo's eyes filled with pure madness and unmitigated despair. He had never anticipated that a minor, low-tier world line could anchor an existential terror of this magnitude. He had initially planned to stall for time until his captain arrived to systematically crush these enforcers. Yet, that primordial titan had deleted Xiao Xiao and Xiangji without encountering a shred of resistance. This is supposed to be nothing more than a low-grade Hengsha world. Zhang Luo muttered to himself, a wild urge to curse short-circuiting his thoughts. Even a galaxy-tier powerhouse had suffered a total deletion loop here. What kind of backwater universe was this? Losing all will to fight, he stared at the approaching silhouettes of his death and Accelerator with utter hopelessness. Even if he somehow managed to defeat these two enforcers, his life cycle would still terminate the moment that Supreme Terror cast his gaze back toward this sector. Waiting to be executed was an agonizing experience. His movements grew increasingly sluggish, his vector shields fading until he completely surrendered his resistance. Isteth's ice soul sword ruthlessly pierced his heart, instantly freezing his remaining life force and sealing his database forever. The vault beneath the headquarters beholding the definitive conclusion of the skirmish, Takumi offered a slow nod. His form fluidly dissolved, fading out of the airspace. When he rematerialized, he stood within a vast, cavernous underground hall built deep beneath the central headquarters of the DEM Corporation. A massive, highly complex runic formula was painted across the chamber floor, converging on two transparent containment pods reminiscent of stasis cabins. Floating inside the preservation fluid were two identical maidens, the Mio Takamiya nodes representing both parallel universes. It was a highly tragic causal loop. The Mio Takamiya of the original universe had attempted to translocate Shido Itsuka to this world server to safeguard his lifeline. However, her arrival was immediately intercepted by the Falcon Transmigrator Syndicate. After extracting the coordinates of the adjacent parallel universe from her memories, they had engineered this entire multi-world crisis. Shido Itsuka, whom she had desperately sought to protect, had been executed by the Falcons to violently strip away his destiny metrics. Since Shido didn't index as the native child of destiny on this specific world line, the rogue transmigrators had zero fear of triggering a system warning. Furthermore, both versions of Mio Takamiya had been forcefully processed as the energetic core to maintain the spatial wormhole. Their infinite lifespans had been completely drained, their matrices were currently navigating a terminal shutdown. For an omnipotent entity like Takumi, restoring their vitality would require nothing more than a minor wisp of effort. Yet, pondering the systemic data, he slowly shook his head. He could save them, but he chose not to. As the spirit of origin, Mio Takamiya existed as the primordial source of every catastrophic anomaly plaguing both world lines. The Eurasian spacequake disaster that had deleted approximately 150 million human lifelines, alongside the endless cycle of young girls forcefully mutated into spirits through the filtering of sapphire crystals, the weight of her sins was simply too astronomical. If he arbitrarily granted her absolution, the surviving civilian populations and the remaining spirits would flatly lose all faith in his divine justice. Balancing the scales between the absolute totality of the world's victims and a solitary spirit of origin, the equation had been heavily skewed from the very beginning. A tragic outcome, yet your life cycles must conclude here. Takumi shattered the transparent containers, releasing the two faded versions of Mio Takamiya. They were currently so profoundly weakened that even an unenhanced human civilian could effortlessly finalize their execution. The Mio Takamiya of the original world line paraded absolute zero desire to continue running her program. She merely fixed her dull, lifeless gaze onto Takumi's form, her vocal arrays completely silent. Having intimately witnessed Shido Itsuka's permanent deletion at the hands of the transmigrators, her psychological matrix had completely shattered. Death was her ultimate, long-sought sanctuary. While the native Mio Takamiya of this timeline remained unaware of the full scope of the variance, the moment she discovered her beloved Shido Itsuka didn't even exist on this server, having been entirely replaced by a gender-bent transmigrator, her consciousness would similarly collapse. Mio Takamiya, across both servers, was undeniably wrapped in a highly tragic script. Takumi gave a brief shake of his head. He calmly finalized their fading life cycles, terminating their agonizing countdown. The fragile fire of the kingdom. As he withdrew his hands, two brilliantly shimmering crystalline matrices rested inside his open palms, the core sapphire crystals of the spirits of origin, representing the absolute core data of Mio Takamiya. Unlike Kurumi Tokisaki and the sibling spirits, who had initially existed as human containers before assimilating a crystal, Mio Takamiya was a pure intelligent lifeform conjured into reality by Isaac Westcott and his cabal, who had utilized advanced sorcery to forcefully pool the entire planet's ley line mana into a singular node. She was the absolute incarnation of raw conceptual spiritual power. Consequently, even assuming their physical husks had sustained a total collapse, as long as these core sapphire crystals remained intact, their existences were far from permanently deleted from the universe. That being said, evaluating the structural health of the two crystals, their parameters tracked at a highly critical index. The space-time ritual deployed to maintain the wormhole had severely overdrawn their origin source code. Tracking the rapidly dimming radiance bleeding from their facets, it was mathematically certain that they would completely exhaust their spiritual resonance and fade into absolute non-existence before long. Takumi possessed the divine authority to restore them, but evaluating the deep-seated hatred Kurumi Tokisaki and the surviving spirits harbored toward the source of their mutations, combined with Mio's own absolute desire to fade away, she clearly harbored zero interest in continuing her life cycle. Thus, Takumi resolved to let nature take its course. He would permit the remaining illumination to peacefully burn out until every wisp of spiritual energy evaporated, completely closing the file on the entity known as Mio Takamiya. Takumi threw the 2 dimming sapphire crystals straight into his divine kingdom, storing them deep within the celestial treasury housing his accumulated sacrifices. However, what completely bypassed Takumi's divine vision the exact moment the 2 crystals stabilized inside his celestial treasury, the incredibly rich, boundless divine aura that permanently saturated every square inch of the divine kingdom began to silently, automatically bleed straight into their dimming facets. Slowly, a microscopic, exceptionally fragile wisp of pristine celestial light quietly ignited deep within the heart of the fading crystals. Like a fragile ember flickering back to life in the dark. Chapter 192. Chapter 192, 100 Years of Allegiance, the Soul of the Neighbor World 1577 words with the loss of Mio Takamiya's core configuration, the reality-warping spatial formula instantly lost its structural anchor. The massive interdimensional wormhole began to seamlessly heal, and the parallel world server slowly, steadily drifted back toward its original cosmological coordinates. Up to this point, the multiversal mission payload was essentially finalized. Takumi calmly stepped forward, his towering silhouette fluidly dissolving straight into a localized fracture in the space-time continuum. When his consciousness rematerialized, he had already successfully returned to the living pavilion of the Itsuka residence. "Oh, boss, you're back. Is the spatial anomaly comprehensively resolved?" Satoru Gojo questioned the moment Takumi cleared the gateway. In absolute reality, even bypassing a direct verbal disclosure, every single combat asset present could intimately feel that the catastrophic collision vectors fracturing the firmament had ground to a complete halt. It was glaringly obvious that Takumi had clinically eradicated the primary source node driving the disaster. Takumi offered a slow, composed nod. Turning his gaze toward Kurumi Tokisaki, his voice unrolled a flat, monumental announcement: the spirit of origin no longer exists within the registries. Whether evaluating this local world server, or the alternate universe line, 0 new spirits will ever manifest from this space-time milestone forward. Is that absolute reality? Hearing his clinical brief, Kurumi Tokisaki felt an incredibly surreal, almost hollow sensation ripple through her mind. The singular, impossible crusade that she had ruthlessly spent countless blood-stained centuries attempting to execute, had been completely, effortlessly resolved by this mysterious vanguard. Even assuming her optical mirrors had failed to intimately witness the total collapse of the primordial spirit of origin with her own eyes, tracking the reality-breaking power paraded by this silver-haired entity, her internal mainframes verified that his data fields contained absolute zero tolerance for error. No matter how immense the parameters of the first spirit scaled across the local universe, she was flatly, mathematically incapable of matching the unyielding authority commanded by this man. ####the despair of the immortal. Following the absolute fulfillment of her lifelong revenge cycle, a sudden wave of intense emotional euphoria and profound existential emptiness simultaneously flooded her systems. She registered raw excitement because her ultimate, heartbreaking wish had been successfully translated into a concrete variable. Yet, a crushing emptiness immediately trailed behind because the precious lifelines that had already been permanently deleted from the past could flatly never be recovered. An intense wave of pure psychological confusion short-circuited her cognitive centers. Suddenly, a localized memory log triggered within Kurumi Tokisaki's data banks. Fixing her heterochromic irises straight onto Takumi's form with a sudden, deeply expectant gaze, she gracefully bent her waist, unrolling a profound bow toward his stance. "Excuse me. Oh magnificent Mr. Messenger, does your omnipotent presence command the structural authority to authorize the resurrection of a specific individual?" Harvesting the contextual data blocks exchanged between Takumi and Shiori Itsuka earlier, Kurumi had successfully derived a rough approximation of his faction's true standing. Though her baseline understanding of the multiverse remained severely unrefined, she seamlessly adopted the formal title of Mr. Messenger to address his profile. Sawa Yamauchi, correct. Takumi countered flatly. Her request completely failed to bypass his predictive algorithms. In unvarnished reality, the solitary reason he had casually rewritten the timeline to perfectly resurrect Origami Tabichi's parents directly before her visual fields was to deliberately engineer this exact behavioral output. At this hypercritical junction, Kurumi Tokisaki completely declined to waste bytes worrying over how his omniscient scanning arrays had effortlessly extracted the private data field detailing Sawa Yamauchi's existence. Her internal modules preserved a solitary, fanatical hope that her long-lost childhood companion could comfortably return to her side. ####. The terms of the covenant. However, Takumi's subsequent verbal delivery instantaneously shattered her hope into microscopic dust. "Why should I help you?" Takumi vocalized with absolute, chilling tranquility. "Your profile and my office track strictly as transdimensional strangers who have scarcely logged an introductory meeting. My network possesses absolute zero causal reasons to distribute a reality-warping grace to aid your container, correct? Your presence clearly." Hearing his clinical rejection, Kurumi subconsciously prepared to argue that Takumi had proactively leveraged Sawa's name as a strategic cover to shield her from Origami Tabichi's lethal focus moments ago. Yet, as her analytical subroutines ran a deeper processing loop, she captured the chilling realization that Takumi had flatly never promised that her compliance would automatically unlock a total resurrection protocol for Sawa. Had her own desperate mind simply run a massive, wishful thinking correlation error? Kurumi Tokisaki subconsciously took a step back across the broken floorboards, her features masking over with deep psychological panic. "Hold your hand," she suddenly shrieked, forcefully interrupting his pivot. Locking her heterochromic eyes dead center onto Takumi's pristine visage, she vocalized with absolute, unyielding desperation, "With provided compliance, if my biological vessel is entirely willing to permanently enlist under your banner, will your supreme presence authorize the perfect reconstruction of Sawa Yamauchi's life cycle?" If this silver-haired entity lacked a basic altruistic reason to aid her timeline, he must have similarly lacked a moral reason to assist that unrefined AST grunt, Origami Tabichi. Through what logic, then, had his authority flawlessly revived Origami's parents? The calculations returned a solitary, absolute answer. He had explicitly mapped out Origami Tabichi's high-density potential parameters, deliberately deploying the resurrection of her parents as a magnificent strategic bargaining chip to effortlessly throw an institutional olive branch to her faction. In unvarnished terms, as long as her own vessel displayed an identical willingness to permanently surrender its autonomy to join his multiversal syndicate, this man could indisputably forge a pathway to bring Sawa Yamauchi back from the grave. Hearing the frantic offer broadcasting from Kurumi Tokisaki behind his stance, Takumi arrested his movement, slowly turning his silver-haired frame to deep-scan her coordinates. Being relentlessly scrutinized beneath the absolute, soul-crushing weight of the sovereign's divine gaze, Kurumi Tokisaki felt her internal systems violently agitate. She lacked the diagnostic tools to verify whether her individual value rating scaled high enough across Takumi's ledger to warrant a miracle of this magnitude, yet the strategic window was a compressed, one-time-only variable. She flatly refused to permit it to slip past her fingers. Sensing the immense, trembling determination lock down her physical framework, Takumi smoothly opened his lips, his voice dropping into a low register. "My office cannot authorize a standard resurrection loop targeting her historical profile." Kurumi Tokisaki's delicate brows violently knitted into hypertense ridges, as her worst-case fears cleared the gate. If that AST grunt was granted the divine right to reclaim her family line, through what mechanical deviation does my account face absolute rejection? Because, running the empirical data streams, Sawa Yamauchi never truly sustained a permanent deletion loop. Her residual spiritual will continuously drifts across the cosmos, currently trapped deep within the fractured coordinates of the neighbor world. The neighbor world was a dimension adjacent to this reality, a realm accessible only to spirits. Kurumi Tokisaki stood completely, hopelessly thunderstruck by the revelation, her logical faculties violently spinning. Sawa Yamauchi was far from completely dead. Yet, running her native parameters, she completely lacked the advanced space-time subroutines required to securely breach the neighbor world's environmental firewalls and safely reconstruct her friend's scattered soul code. ##### The awakening of the core. Her underlying structural situation tracks at a significantly more complex register than simply pulling a standard, anchored soul back from the temporal grave, Takumi explained smoothly, his eyes a pool of calm tranquility. Granted, evaluating my primary authority, the mathematical calculations scale to an identical level of elementary ease. Provided your terminal craves my personal intervention to resolve her gridlock, your profile must submit to serve strictly as my direct subordinate for the subsequent 100 consecutive years. How does your system evaluate the terms of this covenant? 100 years. To an unenhanced human container, that duration represented a massive, terminal chronological loop encompassing an entire lifespan. Yet, scrutinized beneath the parameters of an immortal spirit commanding infinite cellular resilience, a century scaled to nothing more than a minor drop in the cosmic ocean. Understood. My vessel unconditionally accepts the contract. Kurumi Tokisaki affirmed with an unyielding nod of absolute submission. Beholding her total capitulation, a magnificent, serene smile graced Takumi's features. He casually, effortlessly snapped his fingers. An infinite, blinding cascade of pristine celestial arrays violently condensed directly before Kurumi Tokisaki's visual receptors. Deep within the heart of the brilliant illumination, a delicate, beautifully defined human silhouette began to systematically, flawlessly materialize block by block, its biological parameters being woven out of pure cosmic mass. Within a literal fraction of a heartbeat, the pristine physical vessel of a young girl materialized perfectly on the floorboards. Yet, her eyelids remained tightly, lifelessly sealed. This artifact occurred because the physical framework resting before them was nothing more than an empty, unprogrammed biological shell completely vacant of an active soul directory or cognitive conscious matrix. Subsequently, Takumi executed a secondary, resonant finger snap, his primary divine authority ruthlessly piercing straight across the space-time firewalls of the universe. He reached directly into the deepest abyss of the neighbor world, flawlessly capturing Sawa Yamauchi's drifting, residual spiritual will and extracting it from the parallel dimension to merge it into the pristine empty shell. The next chronological microsecond Sawa Yamauchi's long eyelashes subtly fluttered, and she slowly, beautifully opened her dark irises to scan her surroundings. Kurumi, is that genuinely your signature? Chapter 193, Chapter 193, Shared Burdens and the Sovereign Descent of the Princess. 1277 words. Sawa Yamauchi's mind was still trapped in a hazy, deeply disoriented state. Gazing at the simultaneously familiar yet unfamiliar silhouette standing directly before her coordinates, she questioned hesitantly, Kurumi. Her memory logs were fragmented and blurred. Deep within her cognitive database, she vaguely recalled the harrowing reality that her life code should have been permanently terminated by Kurumi Tokisaki's own hands. Had my matrix truly been resurrected? Where exactly do my spatial coordinates currently rest? When a regular human container was forcefully inverted into a monster via a sapphire crystal, their rational ego would completely dissolve. However, that failed to dictate that their memories were entirely purged from the subsystem. Sawa Yamauchi explicitly remembered the agonizing milestone of her death under Kurumi's blades. She also understood that she had mutated into a mindless abomination at the time, leaving Kurumi with zero possibility of recognizing her true identity. Because of this, while her core parameters still placed immense value on Kurumi Tokisaki, a lingering trace of deep-seated resentment had remained archived in her soul. Yet, she found herself entirely unable to truly blame her dearest friend. The century-long covenant beholding her fully restored childhood companion, Kurumi Tokisaki stepped forward, tightly, desperately clasping Sawa's hands in her own as tears threatened to breach her composure. What exactly happened to my physical framework? I thought. Sawa looked down at her pristine, unblemished palms, her voice laced with deep confusion. He is the one who reconstructed your life cycle, Kurumi explained softly, casting a deeply reverent, grateful glance back toward Takumi. A few compressed minutes later, Sawa Yamauchi successfully parsed the exact strategic price Kurumi Tokisaki had authorized to secure her resurrection. The final wisp of residual resentment anchored within her heart instantaneously evaporated into nothingness. Messenger, I humbly implore your presence to permit my station to enlist under your banner as well. This is a debt my own life code should shoulder. I flatly refuse to let Kurumi bear the weight of this century-long covenant all by herself. Sawa Yamauchi turned her frame toward Takumi and unrolled a profound, deeply respectful bow, pleading with absolute earnestness. She was entirely unwilling to watch her dearest friend carry the massive operational burden of 100 years of servitude alone. Takumi directed his calm, ice-blue irises toward her form. This behavioral development fell entirely within his predictive algorithms. Has your terminal fully calibrated the gravity of this decision? Sawa Yamauchi answered with absolute, unyielding conviction. Takumi offered a composed nod, comfortably authorizing her registration into his ranks. Evaluating the net parameters of this interdimensional excursion, Takumi had successfully, systematically recruited Origami Tabichi, Shirori Itsuka, Kotori Itsuka, Kurumi Tokasaki, and Sawa Yamauchi. Furthermore, his system had harvested 5 magnificent strands of primordial violet chi. This unrolled an absolute, monumental win across the ledger. He had genuinely unlocked an unimaginable tier of strategic profit. The Tengu City alarms. However, right dead center at that hyper-satisfying space-time milestone rung. A piercing, high-decibel automated defense siren violently detonated, its thunderous acoustic waves completely saturating the airspace of Tengu City. An active precursor to a spacequake anomaly has been detected within this regional sector. All civilian units are commanded to immediately evacuate to the nearest subterranean shelters. This does not constitute a tactical drill. This is an absolute emergency. Repeating transmission. A spacequake. To think an active spirit node would clear the gateway precisely at this chronological intersection. Sensing a massive, volatile fluctuation of spatial energy violently agitating the coordinates directly ahead, Takumi's features registered a trace of mild surprise. The localized air currents dropped into a hyperdense, suffocating pressure, while ominous flashes of pitch-black energy violently erupted across the horizon. Snapping her gaze toward the sky, the atmospheric framework on the horizon violently convulsed as a colossal, void-black sphere began to aggressively expand outward from the high heavens. The catastrophic physical trauma associated with a spacequake phenomenon was universally engineered by the kinetic expanding force of this exact void-black sphere. Wherever its absolute boundary layer passed, every single material structure regardless of density would be instantaneously ground into catastrophic ruins. Yet, this specific spacequake deployment was destined to diverge entirely from historical scripts. Takumi casually, effortlessly snapped his fingers. The exact chronological fraction the sound echoed, the space-time tremor that had been aggressively descending to flatten the municipal sector plugged into a total freeze midair. It hung completely paralyzed within the open atmosphere, its destructive vectors locked down without inflicting a single wisp of damage onto the grid. The descent of the Princess Satoru Gojo, the absolute initialization of a spirit node clearing the multiversal gateway will automatically trigger a massive spatial shockwave across the local physics engine. Exactly what manner of spirit asset is currently loading onto the server? The Vanguard companions lacked an ounce of survival anxiety, they merely observed the floating anomaly with immense, casual interest. Sawa Yamauchi, who completely lacked access to the group's advanced operational parameters, stared blankly up at the paralyzed black sphere, her countenance a perfect map of pure psychological shock. Through what formulation is a metric of this density possible? Why has the spacequake completely frozen mid-execution? Before anyone could unroll a technical breakdown to resolve her confusion, the massive black sphere violently convulsed. Without a single wisp of early warning, it aggressively, sharply contracted inward until it completely dissolved from the active directory. Takumi unrolled a faint, knowing smile. Stepping forward across the bedrock, his silhouette seamlessly closed the distance, arriving directly before the stunning purple figure, who had materialized the exact milestone the spatial shockwave cleared from the sector. The entity tracking across the zone was a remarkably beautiful young maiden. Her knee-length, rich dark purple hair was elegantly gathered by a pair of purple crystal hair accessories shaped beautifully like butterfly wings, her loose tresses cascading softly down her back to project an ethereal, breathtaking visual aura. She was clad in a magnificent, armor-like astral dress, the flowing skirt layers structured out of delicate, shimmering pink gauze. Exquisite pink feathers traced the center of her chest, mapping elegantly just below her collarbone and across her ribs, seamlessly blending an aura of pure, captivating charm alongside a fierce, heroic martial presence. A magnificent, gold-trimmed stone throne stood proudly anchored directly adjacent to her coordinates. Embedded deeply into the absolute crown of the throne was a monumental, thorn-shaped broadsword sandalphon. Continuous rows of faint, beautiful purple light specks lazily drifted around her physical framework. Her striking amethyst irises paraded an incredible, logic-defying beauty, yet her gaze was concurrently clouded by a wave of deep confusion, as if her internal subroutines were frantically recalculating why the protective black mass wrapping her descent had completely vanished before impacting the terrestrial crust. Yet, even masked beneath a layer of pure bewilderment, the absolute, peerless beauty native to a high-tier spirit was flawlessly, perfectly displayed across her form. Beholding her real-world character configuration for the absolute first milestone, even Takumi couldn't restrain a wisp of silent, internal admiration. Toka Yatagami. The definitive primary heroine tracking across the canonical source material, and concurrently the absolute first spirit node scheduled to interface with the timeline, had officially cleared the gateway at this precise space-time intersection. Naturally, running the active database of the current chronology, the young maiden completely lacked the designation of Toka Yatagami. To the global surveillance networks, her active signature indexed strictly under the operational identification code Princess. At this precise moment, Princess successfully cleared her internal calculation lag, her amethyst irises instantly locking onto Takumi's towering figure as they flooded with a wave of intense, unmitigated hostility. Are your arrays similarly deployed here to execute my life code? Chapter 194, Chapter 194, The Naming of the Princess, and the Warmth of a Divine Palm. 1293 words. Toka Yatagami lightly tipped her toes, leaping gracefully to the apex of her stone throne. With a swift, fluid motion, she drew her monumental broadsword wide at the base and tapering to a deadly sharp point straight from the stone backrest. With a forceful sweep of her arm, a massive crescent of pure purple energy violently sliced through the air, hurtling across the courtyard straight toward Takumi. Confronted by her sudden, high-yield assault, Takumi's expression didn't shift a single fraction. He merely raised his right hand with absolute, effortless nonchalance. An intense kinetic shockwave erupted outward, scattering dust across the ruins. Toka's amethyst eyes widened in utter horror as she discovered that Takumi hadn't shifted a single millimeter. He had flawlessly gridlocked her massive broadsword with his bare palm. Her chest tightened. She violently wrenched her arms back, attempting to pull her weapon out of his grasp, only to discover that the blade was completely anchored within his fingers. What terrifying, absolute physical mass. Now. Being this hyper-aggressive right out of the gate isn't very polite. Takumi's smooth, magnetically deep voice resonated directly beside her ears, leaving her internal processing loops momentarily dazed. Takumi calmly released his hold on her weapon. Parading a gentle, entirely natural smile, he extended an open hand toward her coordinates. Since this tracks as our absolute first meeting, you may address my station as Sephiroth. Toka Yatagami blinked, tilting her head in a profoundly dazed, innocent manner. Within the severely limited confines of her active memory logs, no human had ever greeted her presence with a wisp of authentic warmth or kindness. Aren't humans traditionally violent organisms who strictly know how to hunt, suppress, and attack her vessel without unrolling a single line of dialogue first? Could it be that this silver-haired entity failed to index as a human container at all, but was actually another spirit? I am human, of course. Not every single human baseline conforms to your expectations, Takumi vocalized with a light chuckle, effortlessly deciphering the raw confusion tracing her features. Toka's countenance subtly paled in sheer shock. Through what programming did he seamlessly peek into my deepest internal thoughts? Takumi gave a silent shake of his head. For a pure spirit entity like Toka, born directly out from the condensation of raw spiritual power, her internal emotional matrix was beautifully transparent. Even bypassing his mind-reading subroutines, her expressions were more than dense enough for anyone to decode her exact thoughts. Are your arrays similarly deployed here to execute my life code? After a brief window of silence, Toka repeated her introductory line, a trace of deep-seated sorrow masking her amethyst eyes. It wasn't that her system was running a corrupted paranoia loop, it was her empirical reality. Every single time she materialized on this world server, her vessel was relentlessly, brutally hunted by inexplicable military forces. This marked the absolute causal root driving her to strike first. She had simply lumped Takumi's cohort together with her historical persecutors. In response, Takumi casually advanced 2 paces, smoothly closing the distance until he stood directly before her. Toka flinched, her instincts instantly screaming that he was initializing a combat sequence. Her motor controls desperately tried to authorize a high-velocity leap backward to re-establish her defensive perimeter, but to her absolute horror, she discovered her physical frame was completely locked down. Under her desperate, immobilized gaze, Takumi slowly, gently raised his open hand. Before her cognitive centers could even process his intent, his palm was softly, warmly placed right dead center on top of her head. Toka Yatagami froze. Feeling the gentle, incredibly soothing warmth of his hand softly stroking her long purple hair, her internal mainframes completely stalled. She forgot how to react. Do your firewalls comfortably believe my words now when I state that I am far from your enemy? Takumi's voice was exceptionally harmonious. As he expected, demonstrating reality through empirical action was infinitely faster than unrolling endless verbal explanations. Toka stood rooted to the spot like a beautiful statue. Even after her physical vessel regained its baseline mobility, she refrained from launching a counteroffensive. Her system simply lacked the data to handle a transaction of this nature. Though she computed that this silver-haired mastermind was incredibly bizarre, her soul harbored absolute zero animosity toward his presence. Instead, a profound, deeply comforting sense of safety quietly flooded her core. As a spirit, every single deployment onto the terrestrial plane had been a brutal, terrifying struggle for survival against human artillery. This marked the absolute first milestone where someone had touched her shell with such absolute tenderness. It was an entirely novel, remarkably pleasant experience. Before long, the distant shouts of Satoru Gojo and the remaining Vanguard assets echoed from the bedrock below, drawing both Takumi and Toka's attention back to the group. Among the onlookers, Kurumi Tokasaki paraded the most volatile, thoroughly shell-shocked reaction. She stared blankly up at Takumi, who was currently calmly patting the newly materialized spirit's head, completely dumbfounded. Wait a single minute, exactly how many chronological ticks have unrolled since the spacequake initialized? And they've already synchronized their familiarity metrics to this ridiculous tier. More importantly, through what lawless cheat code does this man manage to abduct another breathtakingly beautiful maiden every single time he steps out of the house? Kurumi felt her internal gears completely jam. She flatly lacked the vocabulary to format a proper complaint. Her gaze instinctively drifted toward her childhood companion, Sawa Yamauchi, who was standing directly adjacent to her coordinates. Could it be that when he seamlessly authorized Sawa's resurrection earlier, his station didn't execute the miracle out of pure altruism, but because his data had flagged an interest in her from the very beginning? Did my own vessel unwittingly walk right into a masterclass honey trap? No way, right? Sensing the hyper-intense, suspicious gaze locking onto her frame, Sawa Yamauchi tilted her head, murmuring softly, "Is something wrong, Kurumi?" "It's nothing structural," Kurumi muttered, quickly shaking her head to forcefully flush the wild theories from her active processing cores. Even assuming her deduction mapped to absolute reality, the century-long covenant had already been hard-coded into the registry. She had bound her allegiance to his banner for the next 100 consecutive years. There was zero mechanical path to alter the ledger now. Takumi smoothly descended back down to the concrete bedrock, bringing Toka Yatagami along within his localized gravity field. Messenger, exactly what classification tracks across her signature? While the veteran Vanguard units easily mapped her structural profile using their metaknowledge database, Kurumi Tokasaki, and Sawa Yamauchi remained entirely in the dark. Toka opened her lips to speak, her vocal arrays formatting a response, but her database completely lacked a personal designation. She didn't know how to introduce her own vessel to the server. Her true name is Toka. Toka Yatagami, Takumi announced with a warm, gentle smile, looking directly into her amethyst irises. Originally wrestling with her internal files, Toka tilted her head in absolute wonderment upon hearing his words. Her expression froze in a state of pure, innocent daze as she pointed an uncertain finger at her own chest. Toka. It is your true designation. Does your soul approve of the metrics? Takumi nodded softly, his smile drenched in a magnificent, reassuring grace. Her striking, amethyst-like irises locked dead center onto Takumi's pristine visage. Deep within her newly initialized emotional matrix, a wave of profound warmth swelled to a historical apex. Subconsciously placing her hand directly over her heart, she lacked the technical understanding to decode the underlying mechanics of this sensation, but her lips fluidly curled upward into a bright, breathtakingly radiant smile. My true name. Toka Yatagami. I love it. Chapter 195. Chapter 195. The Ultimate Sanctuary and Toka's choice. It was evident that Toka Yatagami loved her new name. Seizing this opportunity, Takumi got straight to the point. Toka, would you like to leave with us? Hearing this, Toka was taken aback and asked in confusion. We are leaving this world. To where? Takumi chuckled lightly. Pointing towards the sky, he said, to your sanctuary. Toka Yatagami was visibly moved. Ever since she gained consciousness, every time she materialized in this world, she was met with relentless pursuit and violence. Every single time. The endless cycle of being hunted had filled her with deep hostility and fear towards humanity. All she could do was defend herself and flee from their constant attacks. It wasn't that running was her only option, but rather, her innate kindness prevented her from wanting to harm other living beings. But this kind of life would inevitably reach a breaking point one day. She knew that while she hadn't killed anyone yet, the moment she took her first human life, she would truly become the monster they thought she was. Once that happened, there would be no turning back. But now, someone was telling her that there was a place for her to belong. Those few short words rang in Toka's ears with the force of a thunderbolt. Yes, your sanctuary isn't hidden in some remote corner of this world, Takumi continued. There you will no longer be an anomaly. You will no longer be hunted, and you can live freely. So how about it? Will you come with me? Seeing Toka's reaction, Takumi smiled. He knew her resolve was wavering. At this moment, he felt like a smooth-talking cult leader tricking all the spirits into his fold. No, it would be more accurate to say that all the spirits would willingly choose to follow him. Author's note, due to pacing, I won't detail recruiting the rest of the spirits one by one later. In the Data Live world, the phenomenon of spacequakes had always been a gray area of right and wrong. You couldn't say humanity was entirely wrong. Spacequakes actively endangered their world, and their military response was born out of a desire for self-preservation. But you couldn't blame the spirits either. The devastation caused by their arrivals was never intentional. Who could have guessed that the source of these terrifying spacequakes, the spirits, were actually a group of innocent, pure, and kind-hearted girls? They never wanted to hurt the world. They were simply curious about everything in the human realm. They could display the most brilliant and innocent smiles. Their emotions could be easily swayed by a simple joke. When hungry, they would look at others with pitiful, pleading eyes. When happy, they would jump for joy, and when upset, they would cry and throw tantrums. They were no different from ordinary teenage girls, except that they possessed an otherworldly beauty and charm that far surpassed normal humans. Of course, being cute wasn't a universal pardon, but it certainly earned them sympathy. Seeing them like this, how could any decent person turn a blind eye once they knew the truth? And since Takumi was already here, lending a hand was effortless. There was no way he would ignore them. Can I ask, where exactly is this so-called sanctuary? Toka looked at Takumi with a very serious expression. Naturally, I will send you to the divine kingdom of my god. It is a true paradise. There are other spirits there too. You will definitely love it. Takumi didn't know why Toka asked this so specifically, but he nodded and explained. To Satoru Gojo and the others, this explanation made perfect sense. They knew that Toka and the other spirits were the children of destiny of this world, making them excellent sacrifices. Since Takumi was their senior within the sect, it was only natural for him to collect them for the sovereign. But Toka Yatagami didn't know any of this, nor did she care to. She looked directly at Takumi and stated, I can go with you, but I have one condition. I will only go with you. Wherever you go, I go. I don't want to go to some divine kingdom. Toka pointed right at Takumi, her tone resolute. This time, it was Takumi's turn to be surprised. He hadn't expected her to make such a decision. He had originally thought Toka still didn't completely trust him, and would be reluctant to leave this world. He had assumed that if she did agree to ascend to the divine kingdom, she would simply live in peace and contentment there. But instead, Toka didn't want to go just anywhere, she exclusively wanted to follow him. Takumi chuckled lightly. Toka didn't realize that whether she followed him or ascended to the divine kingdom, it was actually the exact same destination. Even though they had only just met, she already trusted him this much. She really was an incredibly cute and innocent girl. Although he thought this, in order to maintain his current persona, as a mere messenger, Takumi didn't agree directly. Instead, he tested her resolve. Have you really thought this through? As long as you are willing to ascend to the divine kingdom, you can enjoy a blissful life, Takumi pressed. No one will hate you or hunt you down, you can eat delicious food every single day, and your fellow spirit companions will be there to be your friends. Even knowing all this, do you still just want to follow me? I don't know why, but I just want to follow you. Not some god. Hearing Takumi's words, Toka shook her head, and looked at him with unwavering determination. Toka didn't fully understand it herself, but her heart was screaming at her that this was the right choice. Chapter 196. Chapter 196. The Sovereign Return to the Divine Kingdom, and the Complete Unveiling of Divinity 1398 words. Hearing Toka Yatagami's raw confession of absolute reliance, the multiversal chat channel immediately erupted into a wave of playful teasing before Takumi could even formulate a baseline response. Satoru Gojo, Tisk, TSK. Boss, just authorize the contract and accept her terms already. It is an exceptionally rare variable for an asset to archive a tier of trust this absolute toward your signature. Boa Hancock, what a beautifully pure, untainted young maiden. Even this concubine finds her individual parameters remarkably endearing. Shiori Itsuka, since Toka's internal programming displays such fierce reluctance toward being separated from your presence, Mr. Messenger, you might as well comfortably agree. Backed by your boundless, reality-shattering strength, guaranteeing her absolute security is an elementary calculation. To the viewing enforcers, whether Takumi ultimately processed Toka Yatagami as a formal sacrifice to expand his core energy grid, or maintained her as a direct follower was of zero consequence. First, this tracked strictly as Takumi's personal administrative affair, meaning their systems lacked the authority to interfere. Second, since Toka explicitly declined to be translocated independently, they would flatly never force her into a standard sacrificial path. After all, divine devotion within their sect had to be entirely voluntary, otherwise, their collective would be structurally indistinguishable from a standard, malicious cult. Third, their processors mostly operated under the light-hearted mentality of spectators enjoying an incredibly high-value, entertaining show. Does your system genuinely insist on strictly tracking my coordinates alone? Provided your soul has anchored its parameters to that specific choice, my office naturally logs 0 reasons to refuse your entry. Takumi let out a soft chuckle, and gave a gentle shake of his silver-haired head. Pinned against Toka's unrefined, pure earnestness, he truly possessed zero structural justification to decline her request, though the baseline novelty of the arrangement was remarkably refreshing. By this chronological milestone, the overarching operational objectives dominating this parallel world server had been completely, flawlessly finalized. Takumi casually snapped his fingers. The immediate translocation in the subsequent microsecond, a localized spatial tear materialized. Origami Tabichi, who had been stationed deep within the AST command base, and Kodori Itsuka, who had been anchoring the bridge coordinates of the airborne battleship Fraxinus, simultaneously materialized right dead center within the courtyard. Both maidens sustained a brief processing lag, thoroughly stunned by the sudden, instantaneous translocation of their physical frames. However, their cognitive firewalls quickly adapted to accept the current reality. Origami stabilized her metrics the exact moment her optical sensors verified Takumi's presence, while Kodori had spent the entire conflict cycle monitoring the Vanguard's logic-defying parameters via the Fraxinus tracking monitors, meaning her database already preserved a baseline comprehension of his power. Shiori Itsuka lunged forward, tightly, desperately grasping Kodori Itsuka's hands in her own. Sister, through what tactical equation did our frames clear the gateway to arrive here? Exactly what parameters define these strangers? Kodori questioned rapidly, pointing her commander's ribbon straight toward Takumi and the surrounding cohort. Shiori Itsuka gently caressed Kodori's head, her voice dropping into a soft, beautifully transparent register as she systematically unrolled the entire data brief. She held absolute zero back, choosing to formally disclose the ultimate hidden variable, confessing that her soul code actually indexed as a transmigrator who had entered this world line from an entirely foreign server. She had historically suppressed this file strictly because her firewalls sought to protect Kodori from running catastrophic panic loops, but navigating this current space-time intersection, there was zero residual necessity to maintain the shroud. Granted, processing a succession of reality-shattering revelations of this density introduced an immense layer of friction to agitate Kodori's mainframes. Yet, her core algorithms verified an unyielding truth. The older sister her heart unconditionally loved was the exact Shiori standing directly before her coordinates, not some abstract, native soul template that had never once interacted with her life log. Kodori, is your vessel genuinely willing to clear this universe line to venture across the multiverse alongside my signature? My office will unconditionally respect your autonomous choice, Shiori asked, her emotional metrics running an anxious loop. She deeply valued her sister's self-determination, whether Kodori chose to explore foreign cosmic grids or remain permanently anchored within the native server. Yet deep down, her system desperately craved for her sister to remain by her side. So the causal data unrolls a flowchart of that definition. Kodori Itsuka let out a prolonged, deeply reflective sigh. Even assuming you lay out the variables with that degree of transparency, sister, through what logical formulation could my system ever comfortably allow your vessel to depart completely alone? What if your unamplified form encounters malicious entities, or sustains structural bullying in a foreign domain entirely beyond my tracking site? Ergo, wherever your dimensional coordinates shift, my framework shall follow. Weighing the strategic outcomes, Kodori Itsuka unrolled her absolute consent. She formally agreed to integrate into the sect of the god of creation, permanently clearing her native world line alongside Shiori. The parameters were locked down. Kurumi Tokisaki, Sawa Yamauchi, Origami Tabichi, Kodori Itsuka, Shiori Itsuka, and Toka Yatagami. This single tactical deployment to the Date Alive universe server had successfully netted an immense assembly of followers. Takumi offered a deeply satisfied nod of absolute confirmation. Snapping his fingers once more, he unrolled a high-tier mass translocation sequence. Satoru Gojo and the remaining Vanguard enforcers were seamlessly routed back to their respective native universes via independent spatial pathways, while Takumi returned straight to his central domain, ferrying the 6 maidens along within his divine shroud. The descent into paradise. Exactly what cosmological coordinate is this? Wait, what parameters define your true designation again? Toka Yatagami stared blankly at the paradise-like layout of the divine kingdom, her amethyst irises swimming with absolute wonderment. A mere chronological fraction ago, her visual field had flashed with a blinding white light, and she had abruptly rematerialized within this breathtaking sanctuary. Turning her gaze back toward Takumi, her features overflowed with immense, childlike excitement. Yet, just as she prepared to unleash an infinite stream of curious questions, her expression suddenly stiffened. Her processing buffers had completely dropped the file detailing Takumi's actual name. What was the syllable sequence again? Toka recalled that he had explicitly disclosed it during their introductory meeting, but the memory log had temporarily short-circuited under the sheer velocity of the transit, leaving her looking beautifully confused. My real name is Takumi. Watching Toka tilt her head with such an endearing, utterly blank expression, Takumi smiled gently and disclosed his true identity. Takumi, Takumi. My mainframes have securely saved the data file this time. Toka muttered the syllables a few times to calibrate her vocal arrays before executing a small, triumphant cheer, her determination absolute. Excuse me, Mr. Messenger, is this the supreme sanctuary your station designated for the absolute preservation of our kind? Kurumi Tokasaki scrutinized her surroundings with intense focus. The sheer, unadulterated density of the celestial environment thoroughly stunned her internal processors. She felt as though her physical vessel had stepped right into a magnificent fairyland spawned straight out of a legendary dream. This marks my personal domain, where zero hostile assets will ever possess the authority to project a wisp of trouble against your lifelines. Your personal domain? Kurumi Tokasaki froze mid-calculation, her heterochromic eyes expanding slightly. Didn't your verbal logs explicitly state that you intended to translocate our forms straight into the Divine Kingdom? This is the Divine Kingdom, Takumi clarified with a smooth nod. Pinned beneath Kurumi's completely paralyzed, deadlocked gaze, his voice unrolled the ultimate truth, specifically, my Divine Kingdom. Excluding Toka Yatagami, whose innocent modules completely failed to parse the reality-shattering scale of the concept, the remaining 5 girls violently expanded their eyes in absolute, unbridled disbelief. They were far from fools. The realization hit their mainframes like a catastrophic system override. The interdimensional messenger, standing directly before them, was structurally, unyieldingly the true God himself. Every single underlying paradox running through their ledgers was flawlessly resolved. No wonder his presence could rewrite the continuum to perfectly resurrect the dead at a whim. No wonder he could effortlessly neutralize planetary and stellar transmigrators with absolute zero friction. No wonder his authority could comfortably ferry their physical masses across the infinite cosmic grid. He wasn't a mere servant or messenger representing the heavens, he was the supreme, omnipotent deity ruling over reality. Chapter 197, Chapter 197, Two New Strangers and the Threshold of True Godhood. 1393 words in the multiversal chat group. A lively discussion was underway. Because Takumi was the one who had accepted the system mission and initiated the live stream, every single member had witnessed the spectacular conclusion of the parallel world crisis. Umaradoma. I really didn't expect Toka to completely bypass the Divine Kingdom and choose to follow Lord Sephiroth back to his personal world. Speaking of which, I'm incredibly curious about what Lord Sephiroth's world actually looks like. Is it the literal world of Final Fantasy? Shinobu Kocho. I think it is more accurate to say she chose the person rather than the world. It is quite clear that she trusts him implicitly and finds an absolute sense of security in his presence. Isteth, what are you implying by that? Are you suggesting that our sovereign's divine kingdom is somehow less secure than a newcomer's personal domain? Shinobu Kocho, of course not. I was merely expressing a sentimental observation. Tony Stark, anyway, it makes no functional difference where she goes. The guy is a multiverse-tier powerhouse. Do you honestly think he lacks the capacity to protect her? Besides, he is probably quite occupied right now. Saitenshi, what is the meaning behind that he? Umaradoma, Sister Saitenshi, it is best if you do not ask. Saitenshi. The path to true godhood. Lurking silently behind the screen, Takumi read through the chat logs and gave a silent shake of his head with a light chuckle. It was entirely expected of a pervert like Tony Stark to immediately let his thoughts drift in a degenerate direction. However, Takumi had no intention of making any untoward moves toward Toka Yatagami, and the other girls at least, not for the time being. After safely escorting them to the sanctuary of his divine kingdom, his immediate priority was to systematically reshape their physical vessels, elevating them into the sublime state of heroic spirits. Following that, he had smoothly introduced them to Nia Honjo and Yoshino. True to their nature, the girls had already integrated beautifully, quickly becoming close friends. Besides, Takumi genuinely lacked the spare time to indulge in idle distractions right now. The primordial violet chi he had recovered from the 5 slain transmigrators had yet to be fully assimilated and merged into his core database. He intended to seize this optimal space-time window to absorb the cosmic energy and break through straight into the sublime realm of true godhood in one fell swoop. Although the structural quality of his divine physical vessel was already more than dense enough to rival the gods, his soul's evolutionary level had yet to reach that apex tier. It appears that crossing the threshold into true godhood will require a bit more structured cultivation. Takumi cleared the idle thoughts from his mind, feeling entirely unperturbed by the delay. Haste would only destabilize his foundation. There was no immediate rush to force the breakthrough. Right at that hypercritical juncture, a pair of sharp mechanical alerts suddenly detonated simultaneously inside the minds of all chat group members. Devil Lucifer has successfully integrated into the chat group. The strongest soldier of humanity has successfully integrated into the chat group. The moment the system notifications cleared the directory, the active chat channel instantaneously exploded with a fresh wave of vitality. Welcoming the newcomers. Umaradoma, a warm welcome to our newest companions. Saitenshi, more newcomers have cleared the firewall. Welcome, welcome. Sprinkling_flowers. Shinobu Kocho, welcome to the group. If there are parameters you fail to understand, you can navigate straight to the group files. You may vocalize your thoughts, transmit videos, and deep scan archived files simply by reciting your intent within your heart. Umaradoma, at the strongest soldier of humanity. Wait, is this newcomer a literal soldier? Could it be Levi Ackerman? Levi Ackerman, who the hell are you people? Through what formulation did these words abruptly materialize inside my mind? Ingzheng, this domain tracks as a multiversal chat group that structurally bridges infinite heavens and parallel realities. This congregation hosts diverse existences spanning different worlds including soul reapers, demon hunters, ordinary civilians, superhumans, and even immortal deities. Levi Ackerman. Surzek's Gremory, an eternal and immortal deity. Has God not been permanently dead for centuries? Is death, presumptuous insect? To openly blaspheme the supreme sovereign, the sheer, absolute magnitude of my God is something your unrefined intellect cannot even begin to compute. Surzek's Gremory, oh. How amusing. You actually possess the audacity to address my person in such an arrogant tone. Do you even preserve a wisp of data tracking exactly who I am? Tony Stark, the Devil Lucifer. Damn, that name is exceptionally domineering. He sounds exactly like a high-tier raid boss. Nagato Uzumaki, my scanners have just evaluated the profiles. The newcomer commands a raw attribute density indexing firmly at the 6th tier threshold. To possess a combat mass of that density the exact moment of entering the group is remarkably impressive. Accelerator, TCH, merely a 6th tier baseline. The absolute majority of the veteran assets in this channel can easily flatten him. He's nothing more than a minor, low-tier garbage role. Surzek's Gremory, my person a transcendent entity. Categorized as a minor, low-tier garbage role. Fascinating. Truly, spectacularly fascinating. Exactly what parameters define your standing? Your syndicate possesses the skill to pull my spiritual consciousness into this coordinate, bypassing even my own sensory arrays, so you do command some unique capabilities. Why not unroll your true form and engage in an absolute, open duel against my blade? The sufferer and the winner deep within the primary pavilion of the divine kingdom, Takumi sat majestically atop his temple throne. So the data streams mapped to Captain Levi Ackerman, the frontline leader from the attack on Titan World, and Surzek's Gremory, one of the 4 great Satan kings dominating the high school DXD world server. Deep scanning the active chat logs, Takumi quickly verified their systemic profiles. Speaking of Captain Levi, his character file was undeniably anchored to a profoundly tragic narrative loop. In a structural sense, the psychological trauma archived across his timeline scaled to a significantly worse register than even Nagato or Shinobu's history. The absolute root cause of his suffering flowed directly from the actions of the primary protagonists, Eren Yeager and Armin Arlert. The baseline behavioral coding of those two protagonists was simply too preposterous for words. The former was universally classified across the multiverse as an absolute clown, while the latter was recognized as the undisputed titan of Talk-no-jutsu. Navigating all the way to the terminal phase of the script, the clown Eren had ruthlessly slaughtered 80% of the global civilian population, manually controlled a titan to devour his own biological mother, and aggressively manipulated his father down a path of ruin to ultimately exchange the survival of Eldia for a pathetic, compressed window of a mere 100 years of peace. A century later, Paradis Island was completely, systematically vaporized anyway. Yet, despite that catastrophic failure layout, his core companions still emerged as the celebrated heroes who had saved civilization, receiving infinite accolades and wealth until they won so much they grew completely numb to it. Levi Ackerman was the solitary asset, who had shouldered the unmitigated brunt of the structural suffering. Heavily mangled by a detonated thunder spear and severely broken throughout the consecutive battles, his vessel sustained a terminal right eye blindness and a permanently crippled left leg. Concurrently pinned to a wheelchair, he was left to silently watch the literal war criminals who had slaughtered his precious comrades live out their life cycles in immense fame, luxury, and fortune. The sheer density of that psychological torment was truly harrowing. As for Sirzex Gremory, evaluating his baseline attributes, he not only occupied the absolute apex tier of the high school DxD universe, but also indexed as one of the world's solitary 3 superdevils. His raw magical volume completely outscaled the historical parameters of the original Lucifer, existing as the literal incarnation of the power of destruction with a demonic density over 10 times greater than his predecessors. On a personal level, his database registered a deeply devoted wife, a biological heir possessing exceptional potential and an immaculate moral framework, and an elite, hyper-celebrated noble lineage anchoring a profoundly blissful domestic life. Juxtaposed against the broken soldier Levi, Sirzex Gremory was an absolute, undisputed winner in life. Chapter 198, Chapter 198, The Futility of the Survey Corps, and a Super 1578 words. Inside the multiversal chat channel, a sharp chime resounded through the minds of its members as new memory data logs were synchronized. Umaradoma has successfully uploaded the memory files Attack on Titan and High School DxD. Umaradoma, at Levi Ackerman, at Sirzex Gremory, step right up. High-priority spoilers have cleared the gateway. Levi Ackerman has successfully downloaded the memory files. Sirzex Gremory has successfully downloaded the memory files. A prolonged chronological silence saturated the group feed as the newcomers processed the data streams. Levi Ackerman, are the historical fragments recorded across these visual files truly the immutable future of our world server? The realization of a captain back within the bleak parameters of the Attack on Titan world. Levi Ackerman, who had been meticulously executing his daily cleaning routine, pulled over a simple wooden chair to sit down during a rare moment of respite. He spent the consecutive minutes deep scanning the entire video archive uploaded by Umaradoma. When the final frame of the playback faded, his sharp features had contorted into an exceptionally ugly, dark mask. The Titans, every single one of those mindless, flesh-eating abominations, were fundamentally human containers. So the true enemy arrayed against their existence sat strictly on the opposing side of the open sea. And Paradis Island was fated to be completely, structurally vaporized into microscopic ashes a mere century down the line. Having inexplicably digested his own world line's terminal tragedy, the captain navigated an incredibly complex, thoroughly bewildered emotional gridlock. Were those two subordinates Eren Yeager and Armin Arlert suffering from a severe cognitive malfunction? As the ancient paradigm dictated, the immediate players remain hopelessly blind to the board, while the detached spectators map out the coordinates with absolute clarity. To systematically expel the Titans and breach the wall to uncover the underlying truth of this cruel world, exactly how many elite soldiers had their survey corps sacrificed? Infinite lifelines, cut down across consecutive decades. Yet, running the final numbers of the calculation, every single one of those noble sacrifices had been executed for absolute zero return. They had died entirely in vain. The alternate version of his vessel captured within those visual logs had foolishly designated Aaron Yeager as the absolute, guiding hope of civilization. He had even gone so far as to forcefully bypass Erwin Smith's restoration path to grant Armin Arlert the singular opportunity to continue running his life program. Yet, what did the endgame register? The literal war criminals who had systematically slaughtered his precious comrades effortlessly secured infinite fame, luxury, and fortune, parading across the global stage as the celebrated saviors of the world. And what terminal fate tracked across their glorious survey corps? The commander, Erwin Smith, was dead. Hang Zoe was dead. Every single member of Levi's original elite squad was dead. His own physical shell was left broken and crippled, structurally condemned to spend the residual markers of his life cycle confined to a wheelchair, watching the world spin into a farce. A conclusion of that density was entirely unacceptable to his consciousness. An intense wave of pure fury surged through his processors. He desperately craved to physically breach the boundary of that video file, violently seize the titan spinal fluid in his palm, and inject it straight into Commander Erwin's veins himself. Armin Arlert. Through what preposterous calculation was a weak-willed brat of that definition deemed worthy of inheriting the sacred mantle of Commander of the Survey Corps? The feedback of the Enforcer's Amaradoma, that maps the definitive baseline trajectory of your world line. So how do your processors evaluate the parameters now? Have your diagnostic tools clearly flagged the true, underlying colors of Aaron and Armin? Boa Hancock, so this tracks as the typical protagonist's halo your files frequently reference. It is genuinely horrifying. The absolute totality of the loyal assets orbiting his coordinates are ruthlessly snuffed out one after another, yet the core protagonist seamlessly survives the wipe. Well, looking closer, Aaron was technically deleted at the terminal milestone anyway. It appears Armin Arlert is the solitary entity who reaped the absolute protagonist metrics. Ing Zheng, you possess zero reasons to anchor your thoughts to despair, young friend Levi. The exact space-time microsecond your signature cleared the firewall to integrate into this chat group, your destiny, and the overarching macro-future of your world line were permanently rewritten. Provided your soul unrolls a sincere prayer to the Supreme Sovereign, altering a tragic future tracks as an exceptionally elementary computation. Levi Ackerman, permit my internal systems a brief chronological window to decompress. I must explicitly organize these files first. Sirs ex Gremory, my office has deep scanned both the visual media and the textual novels. The data matches seamlessly, I will grant you that. However, through what logical formulation am I supposed to believe this database isn't a complex script fabricated entirely by your own syndicate? Shinobu Kocho, the verification method requires minimal processing power. A sacred ideological framework is archived directly within the group directory. Download the text and chant the mantra within your heart, your vessel will naturally feel the boundless, world-crushing majesty of the Lord Sovereign. Sirs ex Gremory, very well. My person shall intimately test what manner of cosmic authority this supposed divinity truly commands. The power of a superdevil rumble. Deep within the underworld parameters of the high school DXD world. Inside a pristine noble castle anchoring the Gremory territory, a catastrophic, hyperlethal aura violently detonated outward, completely saturating the firmament. The lesser devils and high-ranking servants navigating the domain instantaneously sustained a severe psychological shock, their physical frames trembling in absolute, unyielding terror under the sudden weight. They were intimately aware of the spatial origin anchoring this terrifying pressure. Their irises filled with a mixture of profound awe and paralyzing dread. Lord Satan, what catastrophic variable has agitated your presence? A high-class devil stared toward the central private chambers, his vocal arrays shaking with pure anxiety. Granted, Sirs ex Gremory historically operated with an exceptionally gentle, peaceful behavioral matrix toward his subordinates. Yet, zero intelligent lifeforms were stupid enough to calculate that a superdevil was an asset that could be easily trifled with. Once his core parameters shifted into an active state of rage, the destructive fallout was apocalyptic. They completely failed to compute what had caused Sirs ex to unleash his unmitigated mass. Had an external faction initialized an unmapped invasion against the underworld? That was mathematically impossible. Fascinating. Truly remarkable. It has successfully pulled my spiritual conscious matrix into the digital coordinate twice in a row, completely bypassing my highest sensory firewalls without triggering a wisp of alert, Sirzex Gremory murmured to himself, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of analytical doubt and intense curiosity. With a smooth contraction, the reality-shattering power of destruction swirling around his frame was effortlessly reabsorbed into his physical vessel, the suffocating atmospheric weight completely evaporating from the castle. The devils occupying the regional sector felt an immense mountain forcefully lifted from their spines. Every single one of them exhaled a ragged breath of profound relief, wiping cold sweat from their brows. The crimson-haired Satan King was simply too terrifying. Absolute horror. He was indisputably one of the underworld's solitary three transcendent entities. Ever since my signature ascended to assume the mantle of Satan Lucifer, the volume of adversaries qualified to comfortably exchange blows alongside my blade has dropped to a literal handful, all apex figures commanding the absolute pinnacle of foreign factions. Pinned beneath the structural administrative duties of my office, my vessel hasn't engaged in a high-intensity combat cycle for an immense chronological span. Sirzex reflected silently. The denizens of the underworld universally held the Crimson Satan in supreme regard. He proudly commanded an absolute, logic-defying tier of raw destructive force, yet he routinely declined to utilize primitive violence to resolve administrative bottlenecks. His strategic elegance and calm disposition were immaculate. In unvarnished reality, that behavioral pattern manifested because excluding those few cosmic tier powerhouses, the rest of the multiverse represented an insignificant garbage tier that completely failed to warrant his seriousness. It was conceptually identical to an adult staring down at a newborn infant who was screaming a challenge. The adult would merely offer a calm smile, completely unaffected by anger, and decline to archive the threat inside their system. But the parameters had officially shifted on this afternoon. An unmapped existence had effortlessly extracted his spiritual consciousness and anchored it within an alien domain, entirely bypassing his highest cognitive defenses. While this development introduced a severe shock to his analytical firewalls, it concurrently triggered an immense wave of pure, long-dormant excitement. Let my person intimately verify exactly what manner of primordial entity dominates your sector. Sirzek's eyes burned with an intense, hyper-focused thrill. Recalling the sacred ideation mantra archived within his memory buffers, he ignored the sudden arrival of his silver-haired queen, Graphia Lucifegus, who had frantically cleared the gateway to investigate the sudden atmospheric detonation and calmly initialized the chant. Please lend your divine ear to my most sincere call. Has Sirzex completely short-circuited his own logical mainframes? Graphia Lucifegus stood completely rooted to the spot, her silver irises violently expanding in pure, unadulterated bewilderment. Was her sensory subsystem generating a massive optical hallucination? Her own magnificent, supreme Satan husband was actually kneeling on the floor, deeply immersed in a solemn prayer to a higher god. Moreover, according to every piece of historical data recorded across the underworld archives, had the biblical god not been permanently dead since the Great War centuries ago? Chapter 199, Chapter 199, The Absolute Subjugation of a Super. 1607 words deep within the pristine architecture of the Divine Kingdom, a crystalline mechanical chime suddenly vibrated through the air, signaling a fresh influx of multiversal energy. Detected 1 point of faith power originating from the High School DXD world server. Applying a 12 million-fold multiplier. Host successfully receives 12 million points of faith power. Sirzex Gremory, one of the three native transcendents. Sitting majestically atop his temple throne, Takumi's ice-blue eyes flashed with a thoroughly amused, playful glint. Since your database has long concluded that being completely invincible is a terribly lonely existence, my office shall graciously grant your vessel a taste of absolute, unmitigated defeat. The fractured consciousness meanwhile, back within the underworld parameters of the High School DXD world. The precise space-time millisecond the final syllable of the sacred meditation mantra cleared his lips, Sirzex Gremory felt his entire consciousness violently shudder. An unmapped, completely logic-defying cosmic force seamlessly bypassed his highest cognitive firewalls, aggressively invading the deepest core of his soul matrix. A mere parlor trick. Surzex remained entirely unfazed, his baseline composure unshaken. However, the exact moment he initialized an internal subroutine to forcefully purge this alien energy, he made a startling discovery: the mysterious force had already quietly expanded from his spiritual core, weaving itself so deeply into his origin code that it was entirely impossible to suppress. Before he could deploy a secondary defensive firewall, his entire environmental framework underwent a catastrophic, instantaneous rewrite. The burning crimson skies of the underworld dissolved into a uniform, completely featureless gray. Time ceased to flow. Space lost all definitive boundaries. It was an absolute, infinite void, an endless expanse reminiscent of primordial chaos before the dawn of creation. Standing dead center within this boundless chaos was a colossal, awe-inspiring deity whose sheer physical presence seemed to effortlessly span from the lowest abysses to the highest heavens. He stood as the absolute, undisputed focal point of the cosmos, the supreme origin of all material existence. The zero-hope skirmish. Surzex analytical mainframes registered zero survival panic. With a violent snap, a pair of massive, bat-like devil wings aggressively unfurled from his spine, throwing off a catastrophic, hyperdense aura that completely saturated the gray space. Rumble. The raw, apocalyptic power of destruction swirling within Surzex's cells condensed into an infinite barrage of crimson magical orbs, screaming through the void to ruthlessly liquidate Takumi's divine manifestation. A grand, infinitely majestic voice boomed with slow, unyielding authority. The single word resonated simultaneously from the absolute past, the immediate present, and the unmapped future, completely saturating every dimension of the space-time continuum. In a compressed microsecond, the infinite magical projectiles filling the sky were instantaneously, silently wiped from reality, leaving zero energetic residue behind, as if they had never been cast. Before Surzex could process the anomaly, an invisible, absolute law swept through the heavens and the earth. Surzex's towering transcendent silhouette was silently, flawlessly reduced to subatomic powder, cleanly erased from the active directory of existence. The cycle of 999 deaths in the subsequent chronological fraction, Surzex's physical form was perfectly, seamlessly reconstituted. Yet, the visceral, chilling sensation of absolute, undeniable death remained vividly imprinted upon his neural pathways. His internal processors reeled in absolute disbelief, his cognitive gears jamming. How is this mathematically possible? Refusing to allow his pride to collapse, Surzex violently forced his attributes to the absolute limit, launching another frantic, high-yield offensive against the silver-haired entity. The results yielded zero variance. He was ruthlessly, effortlessly spoken out of reality by Takumi's words. 3 times. 999 consecutive times. I concede absolute defeat. This logic-defying authority belongs indisputably to a true God in existence who infinitely, completely outscales the original biblical God of our world line. Surzex vocalized his total surrender, his spirit thoroughly convinced. Yet, beneath his submission, his crimson irises suddenly burned with a brilliant, reignited flame. A magnificent new paradigm had unrolled before his sensors. He had successfully isolated a grand target to conquer. The cosmos was infinitely vaster than his primitive underworld databases had recorded. There existed countless unmapped parallel worlds completely beyond his previous sight. He would grow stronger. And eventually, he would challenge Takumi once more. The demonic transaction, my baseline parameters, have genuinely expanded. Surzex unsealed his physical eyes back inside his castle chambers. Sensing the profound, qualitative evolution running through his demonic reserves, he gave a slow shake of his head, a wry, self-deprecating smile gracing his lips. Granted, because his foundational parameters as a transcendent were already parked at the absolute peak bottleneck of his native universe, the margin for further growth was naturally constrained, yet his raw power metrics had indisputably scaled higher. Surzex was profoundly satisfied. For an absolute powerhouse of his classification, nothing triggered a higher spike of pure euphoria than breaking through an impossible bottleneck and finding a new mountain to climb. He had reigned as Satan Lucifer for an immense chronological loop, enduring an absolute, suffocating loneliness at the top. Concurrently speaking, his mainframes completely lost all interest in monitoring trivial local squabbles such as the bickering of the hero faction, the mundane movements of the Cows Brigade, or the continuous, peaceful slumber of Great Red. His sights had been forcefully expanded. He was gazing significantly higher, into the infinite reaches of the multiverse. As long as my office systematically organizes the preaching of his name and structures grand sacrifices, my parameters will continuously scale. Surzex meticulously audited the sacred text files archived within the chat group's shared directory, his lingering doubts effortlessly vaporizing. The God of creation was indisputably decoupled from their localized theological framework. He was an outer primordial entity dominating realms completely beyond their few-dimensional planes. The sovereign could seamlessly project his manifestation across infinite parallel universes, whereas the local powerhouses of the underworld couldn't even breach their own world boundaries. The sheer preposterous gap between their evolutionary tiers required zero further computation. However, as one of the underworld's solitary three transcendents, Surzek's pride refused to let him succumb to despair. He would simply ride the wave to scale his own parameters. While the concept of high-tier devils offering fanatical devotion to a higher god violated every traditional law of their world, Surzex calculated that it was of minor consequence. This entity completely transcended the dead biblical god of their local history, and they shared zero structural relation. Furthermore, unrolling the exact flowchart of the transaction, he would assist the god of creation by expanding his faith across the server, harvesting rare world treasures to offer as consecrated sacrifices, and the God of creation would distribute divine feedback to amplify his power metrics. This tracked as a perfectly balanced, immaculate transaction. It aligned flawlessly with the Devil's core code of conduct. The orders to the Silver Queen, Graphia, Surzex called out smoothly. "I am here, Lord Surzex." Clad in her immaculate maid vestments, Graphia Lucifegus stepped forward. Monitoring her husband's highly anomalous, intense expression, a trace of deep hesitation rippled through her silver irises. Surzex appeared fundamentally altered, his aura vibrating with a terrifyingly fresh density. "This file archives the meditation mantra, viewing ideas, which my consciousness just fully integrated. Initialize the chant within your own heart first to calibrate your metrics, and then systematically distribute the code. Every single devil navigating within the Gremory territory must formally bind their faith to this supreme god. This administrative directive carries absolute, overriding priority. Execute the deployment immediately, and initialize a global collection protocol to harvest rare treasures. The grander the volume, the better." "Understood. Your command shall be executed immediately." Graphia opened her lips, briefly hesitating, as if her processors craved to query the underlying rationale, but she ultimately suppressed the prompt. She understood her husband's true nature intimately, though she routinely maintained a strict, no-nonsense discipline to manage his daily affairs. She would unconditionally submit to Surzek's absolute authority regarding high-tier strategic decisions. Execute the primary mandate first, process the underlying field equations later. The rerouting of Destiny Sacred Gears and Longinus-class artifacts track as premium transactional mass, perfectly optimized to serve as consecrated sacrifices to the God Emperor. Reviewing the historical media streams archived in the group directory, Rias has yet to cross paths with that human brat, Issei Hayadu. Should my office proactively coordinate an asset recovery loop to forcefully strip away the boosted gear, the Longinus-class artifact anchoring the Welsh dragon from his soul matrix? Negative, there is zero structural necessity to force an aggressive extraction loop. My person preserves a mild liking for the boy's baseline nature. I can comfortably recruit his container to operate as a direct subordinate under my command, even keeping his Longinus artifact. His growth parameters will merely serve to expand my vanguard's strength. However, Rias and her peer circle must be strictly prohibited from forming any romantic or karmic ties alongside Issei Hayadu. While that introduces a minor, unfortunate rerouting of the boy's original destiny layout, scrutinizing the macroscale variables, whether mapping out her long-term evolutionary future or calculating the strategic prosperity of our lineage, the god of creation stands as an infinitely superior, flawless match for Rias and the others. To comfortably compensate the boy for this destiny alteration, I can easily introduce his container to a succession of exceptional, high-tier beauties across the demon noble houses. For a baseline container of his specific psychological programming, that tracks as a remarkably splendid bargain. Surzex finalized the calculations within his internal mainframes. Shifting his coordinates, he cleanly exited the underworld server, translocating straight toward the human realm, specifically heading toward Kuo Town, where his younger sister, Rias Gremy, was currently stationed. Chapter 200, The Awakening of Humanity's Strongest Soldier, and the layout for a new crown. 1587 words deep within the silent expanse of his temple, Takumi retracted his divine consciousness, his expressions shifting into a thoughtful gaze. Surzex Gremy. He was certainly an intriguing asset. To endure being utterly obliterated and systematically executed 999 consecutive times, without his psychological core fracturing into absolute non-existence, the crimson-haired Satan King possessed a borderline masochistic tier of unyielding resilience. Perhaps his silver-haired queen had rigorously conditioned his psychological parameters over the centuries. Regardless, his efficiency in disseminating the viewing ideas text across his server is highly defined. Takumi thoroughly appreciated Surzek's decisive execution speed. These were precisely the high-caliber believers his network required. Through his divine sensory arrays, he could intimately feel the volume of his consecrated followers expanding at an exponential rate. These fresh signatures belonged exclusively to the high-tier devils occupying the vast Gremmery territories within the underworld. Before long, the absolute entirety of the demon realm would comfortably transition into Takumi's primary missionary playground. Restraining his expansive consciousness, Takumi shifted his tracking modules back toward the interior layout of the Divine Kingdom. The guidance of the sacred pavilion, the celestial sun was slowly dipping below the horizon, bathing the paradise in a soft, ethereal golden light. Inside her private pavilion, Kane Kocho had just finished bathing, her physical vessel radiating a delicate scent of pristine incense and floral waters. Ever since her translocation into the upper server, Takumi would routinely step past the threshold to personally guide and optimize her spiritual attributes whenever his office logged a free space-time window. Consequently, her system remained permanently primed, elegantly attired and waiting for the sovereign's arrival at any given microsecond. Even though Takumi refrained from materializing inside her quarters daily, she meticulously adorned her form every single afternoon, her heart filled with quiet, beautiful anticipation. Takumi unrolled a faint, tranquil smile. With a silent spatial flicker, his physical form seamlessly bypassed the structural barriers, re-manifesting directly before Kane's coordinates. "My greetings to honor the presence of my supreme god," Kane Kocho murmured softly. Caught off guard for a mere fraction of a heartbeat, her visual receptors instantly locked onto his silver-haired form, her countenance melting into a wave of pure, joyful surprise. "Deepest thanks, my lord." Kane Kocho slowly pushed her delicate frame off the floorboards. Her pale, jade-like fingers nervously, lightly tugged at the hem of her vestments, a beautiful crimson blush rapidly painting her soft cheeks. Her internal systems desperately craved to take a proactive step forward, yet a trace of innocent timidity anchored her motor controls. Bypassing any unnecessary verbal loops, a grand, profoundly joyous atmosphere instantaneously saturated every corner of the Divine Kingdom. Infinite arrays of celestial flora and rare emerald trees gracefully swayed in unison across the landscape. Boundless rows of divine flowers blossomed simultaneously, parading an otherworldly, delicate aesthetic beauty. The colossal, sky-piercing sacred trees rustled their golden leaves, explicitly vibrating with pure, unadulterated reverence as Takumi initiated a deep, highly focused guidance session to optimize Kane's core parameters. The shattered worldview of a soldier concurrently speaking, deep within the bleak parameters of the Attack on Titan world server. Inside the quiet operations office of the Survey Corps headquarters, Levi Ackerman sat frozen, his analytical modules entirely overwhelmed by the memory streams he had just ingested. Primitive livestock and ordinary beasts are instantly transmuting into high-tier holy creatures, while unenhanced civilian maidens scale into omnipotent goddesses within a single evolutionary milestone. Those baseline, crippled believers merely knelt to unroll a collective chant, and their permanently severed limbs and broken joints instantly regrew out from their bodies. Is this the true scale of the entity they designate as the god of creation? It is genuinely terrifying. A Titan lacks the structural mass to match even a solitary speck of dust hovering before his absolute majesty. Deep scanning successive rows of logic-defying video evidence, Levi's core worldview sustained a monumental, crushing shock. His inherently severe, stoic countenance darkened into a hypersolemn mask. He required an immediate chronological window to stabilize his cognitive firewalls and digest the sheer density of the multiversal data. An unmapped span of time quietly ticked past. Levi gradually forced his ragged breathing back into a steady, controlled rhythm. To speak with absolute candor, his psychological framework still wrestled with a mild layer of reluctance regarding these cosmic tier variables. Yet, he was a battle-hardened soldier, not a cowardly escapist who ran from reality. Since the unyielding empirical data sat directly before his scanners, no amount of mental denial would ever alter the physical facts. The subsequent strategic roadmap was exceptionally simple. He would ruthlessly eradicate every single Titan filtering across this server, leveraging the boundless authority of the god of creation. He would systematically, flawlessly flatten the global military mass of Marley. And as for Eren Yeager, Armin Arlert, and the treacherous warrior trio hidden directly within the ranks of the Survey Corps, not a single one of them would be permitted to clear the gateway alive. Please lend your divine ear to my most sincere call. Recalling the sacred ideation mantra downloaded straight into his memory buffers from the group directory, Levi closed his eyes and initialized the chant. The exact millisecond the final syllable cleared his lips, his consciousness briefly bypassed the physical plane, scanning the outline of that primordial, indescribably magnificent cosmic entity. So this tracks as an authentic deity. Sensing an immense, hyperdense wave of raw kinetic power violently flooding his cellular framework, Levi extended his bare hand, casually gripping the corner of the heavy, solid oak desk beside his stance. With a gentle squeeze of his fingers, the dense wood deformed like soft clay under his palm, leaving a deep, perfectly molded handprint behind. Although his system currently lacked a localized baseline to run a precise comparative benchmark, Levi's tactical intuition verified that he could comfortably slaughter an entire vanguard of Titans single-handedly, completely bypassing the necessity to equip omnidirectional mobility, ODM, gear. Calming his internal power metrics, Levi consciously linked his terminal back into the active group chat. The strategy for a new throne. Levi Ackerman, everyone, my office requires immediate operational data. Through what formulation can my vessel maximize the velocity of preaching and compiling grand sacrifices? Do your networks preserve any optimal recommendations? Ingzheng, the computation requires minimal effort, young friend Levi. Scrutinizing your local world server, the environment completely lacks any extraordinary energy matrices outside the primitive power of the Titans. My office can easily distribute a few foundational cultivation manuals to your terminal. Backed by the coordinated assistance of our group enforcers, your vessel can easily flatten the global matrix within a compressed timeline. Following that, simply liquidate the puppet king lounging inside the inner walls, claim the supreme throne for yourself, and bind the entire nation's institutional faith to honor the sovereign. Boa Hancock, this concubine can comfortably allocate a rare devil fruit to your account. With an item of that classification integrated into your profile, those mindless, oversized giants will flatly lack the capacity to breach your defenses. Levi Ackerman, TCH. My internal monitors preserve a highly accurate reading of my own capabilities. I am a soldier, not a sovereign. I harbor absolute zero interest in managing the tedious administrative components of governing a nation. Satoru Gojo, in that case, wouldn't the roadmap develop significantly smoother if you simply engineered a script to seat your commander, Erwin Smith, directly onto the royal throne instead? Levi Ackerman, the strategy tracks at an exceptionally high register. Let us hardcode that parameter into the files. Erwin Smith is infinitely more qualified to shoulder the mantle of the crown than those corrupt puppets currently decorating the inner palace. Boa Hancock, excellent. My station shall transmit the consecrated item via a group red envelope shortly. Down within the tropical parameters of the One Piece world, Boa Hancock subtly squinted her beautiful eyes, her lips curling into an elegant smile. Allocating a solitary devil fruit from her secure vaults meant negligible structural loss to her standing as a warlord. After all, her system was programmatically prohibited from consuming multiple fruits anyway. Exchanging a redundant material asset to securely lock down a high-value favor from the sovereign's newest enforcer was a spectacularly profitable transaction. Furthermore, if the magnificent sovereign bears witness to her tireless, devoted efforts to assist new group members in expanding his multiversal faith, His Majesty will undoubtedly register her signature with supreme favor correct. Truly a masterclass deployment, effortlessly killing two birds with a single stone, while guaranteeing her office reaped zero deficit across the board. Levi Ackerman. My office logs its appreciation. Thank you. Had the environmental variables allowed a choice, Levi's personal pride would have strongly driven him to decline any material assistance from foreign multiversal entities. Bypassing his structural self-esteem, he intensely loathed entering an unmapped transaction with interdimensional strangers before the operational layouts were thoroughly verified. After all, a debt of human sentiment was universally the most complex metric to balance across a life cycle. However, the current situation was entirely anomalous. If his vessel stubbornly declined to accept the Vanguard's operational backing, relying strictly on his own unamplified military rank to slowly compile premium sacrifices, would demand an immense chronological loop. At his current baseline, he was neither a wealthy global tycoon nor an elite high-ranking state minister commanding an empire's treasury. Without political leverage or imperial infrastructure, exactly where could a solitary captain go to prepare a grand sacrifice worthy of a god? Accepting the resource payload was the strictly logical path to clear the gate. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.